71 years ago, a 9-year-old boy vanished in the middle of a peaceful afternoon in a coastal Florida town, disappearing without a trace, leaving his family devastated and the community in shock. Authorities suspected the father, who was closest to the scene, of being involved, but with no body found and too few clues to go on, the investigation quickly stalled. Yet through all those years, a desperate mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim belief that her son was still out there somewhere, still waiting to be found. Then one day, when an old piece of evidence was re-examined using modern technology, it revealed a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked, a detail that could turn the entire case upside down and shock everyone involved in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to support us. Clearwater, in the summer of 1954, had an air of tranquility that seemed untouched by any turmoil. The streets along the coast were bathed in golden sunlight. Kids rode bikes in groups, laughing and tossing balls to each other, with no thought of watching out for strangers. Crime barely existed in the imagination of the small town. Doors were often left unlocked, and mothers like Mary Carter could send their sons to the store without a worry. Mary, 32 years old, was a woman who always looked gentle, but had the sharp eyes of a teacher used to observing. Her husband, Edward Carter, worked at a gas station near the harbor, with a sturdy build and a calm demeanor. Both adored their only son, 9-year-old Benjamin Carter, the child many in the neighborhood called the sweetest kid in Clearwater. Benjamin had lightly curly brown hair that was always messy on his forehead, clear gray eyes like the sea at midday, and a small but agile frame. He loved adventure stories, especially tales of jungles and exploration that Mary read to him before bed. At school, Benjamin wasn't the boisterous type. He was quiet, polite, and a bit shy, the kind of kid who blushed easily when praised. But lately, Mary had noticed her son acting stranger than usual. Sometimes during breakfast, he would stare out the window for a long time, as if trying to make out something in the yard. One afternoon, while helping his mother fold laundry, Benjamin suddenly said, "I saw a man standing at the corner. I think he was looking at me." Mary paused, but just smiled and ruffled his hair. Kids sometimes had wild imaginations, especially dreamy Benjamin. She had no idea that those words would haunt her for decades. That day was mildly hot, with a clear blue sky and sunlight stretching over the white sandy roads, as if all of Clearwater was melting into peacefulness. Around 6 o'clock, Mary realized they were out of sugar and eggs. She turned to Benjamin, who was sitting on the porch steps tinkering with his old but still functional bike. "Go to Pine Hill Market and get me some sugar and a carton of eggs, okay? You'll be back in 15 minutes. Benjamin nodded, excited at the chance to ride his bike for a bit. He slipped on his rubber sandals, pocketed a few coins, and pedaled off, the wheels crunching on the sandy road in that familiar sound Mary had heard for years. As Benjamin turned the corner, Mrs. Pauline, the neighbor who had lived next to the Carters for over 20 years, happened to look up at just the right moment. She saw the boy pedaling toward the small market, and right after, in the shade of the large banyan tree at the intersection, Mrs. Pauline spotted a strange man standing perfectly still like a statue. She couldn't see his face clearly, only a dark brown jacket and the way he tilted his head, watching Benjamin as if he'd been waiting. Mrs. Pauline hesitated for a moment, but then told herself he was probably just a passerby. Clearwater had plenty of tourists. Still, the image sent a slight chill down her spine. At Pine Hill Market, Benjamin propped his bike next to the planter, walked in, and bought the items as usual. But when he stepped out, his eyes met those of the man in the brown jacket, standing right in front of the door, just a few steps away. No one heard what they said, and no one knew how the boy reacted. Only a passerby caught a glimpse of the two standing closer than normal before the crowd blocked the view. That was the last time anyone in town saw Benjamin Carter. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Mary stood in the kitchen, glancing out the door now and then, as she always did when Benjamin ran errands. When the clock neared 7, her heart started pounding for no reason. She opened the door, ran out to the yard, looked down the road to the market, then rushed over to Mrs. Pauline's. After just a few questions, chaos began building in her chest. She and Mrs. Pauline split up to search the streets, calling Benjamin's name until their voices were hoarse. Edward came home and joined the search, running from the beach to the park, from the main road to the quiet paths. Neighbors quickly joined in, flashlights sweeping through bushes, lawns, the shoreline, but all they found was chilling silence. No one had seen Benjamin. There was no trace of where the boy had gone, or who he might have met. As the sky darkened and the waves crashed against the shore like a spine-chilling warning, Mary stood frozen in the yard, her hands trembling so much she couldn't close them, her breathing ragged as if she might collapse. Mrs. Pauline just placed a hand on her shoulder, but no words of comfort could stop the fear tightening around Mary's chest. Finally, as if acting on instinct alone, Mary staggered back into the house, her steps unsteady like walking through fog, picked up the wall-mounted phone with ice-cold hands, and managed to utter the only words she had strength for. "Police, my son is missing." On the other end of the line, operator Bonnie Hartman immediately recognized this wasn't an ordinary call. It was the voice of a mother plunging straight into panic. The clock read exactly 8:12 p.m. when Bonnie opened the emergency log and tried to get Mary to repeat the details, but all she heard were fragmented, choking phrases pulled from a chest that felt like it was being squeezed. Without wasting a beat, Bonnie hit the dispatch button. Her voice turned sharp and decisive as it echoed through the internal radio system, calling the nearest patrol unit to 214 Bayview Road, the Carter home. Clearwater was a small town. Roads were quiet, houses close together, so in less than 6 minutes, the red and blue lights of the patrol car swept across the front yard. Officer Marcus Doyle stepped out first, followed by Henry Lewis, both with professional expressions, but not exactly hurried. To them, most calls like this ended with bringing a kid hiding at a friend's house back to panicked parents. But when Mary opened the door, her eyes swollen with tears and hands shaking uncontrollably, a heavy feeling hit them faster than expected. She struggled to repeat what she'd said. Benjamin left around 6, went to Pine Hill Market, said he'd be right back. But more than 2 hours had passed with no sign, and everywhere in the area had been searched. Doyle asked her to sit down, trying to calm the atmosphere, while Lewis noted the description, age, height, clothing, and the red bike that had been with Benjamin since he was 7. Edward came in too, out of breath, face streaked with sweat, saying he'd checked all the places the kid liked to play, all the alleys, the whole beach area. He repeated that Benjamin never went far without telling his parents, but when asked for the exact time the boy left, Mary hesitated between 5:40 and 5:45, while Edward thought it was just before 6. These small discrepancies, completely normal for a family in shock, made the officers privately think this might not be an urgent case. After gathering the initial story, Doyle and Lewis drove to Pine Hill Market to survey the area, said to be Benjamin's last known location. When they arrived, the store lights were still on, a few curious locals standing on the porch chatting. No one cordoned off the area, no one cleared the scene to preserve it, and really, no one was treating it as a crime scene yet. Doyle approached the store owner, a thin man with a slightly hunched posture, and asked about the boy. He remembered Benjamin coming in to buy sugar and eggs, then leaving normally, with no signs of fear or coercion. It was still twilight, so if anything unusual had happened, he figured he'd have noticed. Lewis walked around the outside area where the small planter and cement sidewalk met, but the spot where Benjamin had stood was already trampled by countless footprints from the gathering crowd. No markers, no photos, no efforts to preserve the ground that might have held important traces. The first witness, Mrs. Pauline, recounted seeing the strange man under the banyan tree watching Benjamin, but when Doyle pressed for details on face, height, or build, She could only say he wore a brown jacket and stood very still. The second witness, a man coming from the beach, said he thought he saw Benjamin talking to someone, but he wasn't sure, having only glanced for a few seconds while hurrying home before dark. The third witness was the waitress from the nearby diner. She remembered the red bike propped by the planter when she started her shift, but it was gone when she finished. The fourth witness was a fifth-grade student passing the market, who said, "I think I saw someone standing close to Benjamin, but he wasn't sure if the person was old or young, tall or short." 4 statements, 4 fragmented memories, none clearer than a shadow. All were recorded, but none carried enough weight to escalate the alert to a kidnapping. To them, it felt more like a boy wandered off than someone took the boy. By 8:45, Officers Doyle and Lewis wrapped up the preliminary survey and filed a report with a dry note. No clear signs of criminal activity observed. Possible the boy wandered off on his own or to another area. The town of Clearwater still had its lights on, people chatting on porches, and the atmosphere retained the complacency of a place too accustomed to peace. But for Mary Carter, leaning against the doorframe, staring at the darkening road ahead, that moment marked the first drop into an abyss she had no idea she was about to face. From Doyle and Lewis's initial report, the Clearwater Police Department immediately began reconstructing the timeline of the afternoon. Benjamin disappeared, trying to piece together the scant details into the clearest sequence possible. And though the data was very limited, 3 time points were considered indisputable due to overlapping statements from family, neighbors, and the store owner. The first occurred at 5:43 p.m., the moment Mary clearly remembered Benjamin pedaling out of the yard as the kitchen clock had just hit 43, and she watched him for a bit before turning back to the sink. The second was at 5:57 p.m., when the Pine Hill Market owner confirmed a boy matching the description entered bought sugar and eggs. Though he couldn't recall the exact moment Benjamin left, he was sure the boy didn't linger long since the store was quiet. The third time point was 6:10 p.m., when the waitress from the nearby diner remembered seeing the red bike, the only one in the area, propped by the planter as she passed the store to start her shift. These 3 points formed a timeline backbone the police could rely on, but between them lay a strange dark gap stretching from 6:10 to around 6:25 or 6:30. An empty stretch no witness, even those passing the area minutes later, could precisely explain what happened to Benjamin. The timeline grew even more chaotic as the scattered witness statements intertwined like threads of different colors and lengths, making the overall picture blurrier the more it was examined. Mrs. Pauline said she saw Benjamin pause upon spotting the strange man under the banyan tree as he turned the corner, around 5:47 to 5:48, but she wasn't sure if the man was still there when Benjamin reached the market. The beachgoer witness recounted thinking he saw Benjamin standing and talking to someone in front of the store around 6:05 to 6:07, but he admitted only glancing while walking quickly to get home before dark. The 5th-grade student passing the market said he saw someone standing near Benjamin, but didn't know how long they were there or if they interacted. Meanwhile, the waitress saw the bike, but not Benjamin, meaning at 6:10, when she passed. Benjamin was no longer by his bike. That led to 2 possibilities. Either he left alone after exiting the store, or he left with someone but no one noticed. Police tried mapping movements around Pine Hill Market based on witness positions and timings, but it was like a puzzle missing too many pieces. The beachgoer came from the west. Mrs. Pauline was to the east, the waitress from the north, the student from the south, but none saw the same clear image. Each account was just a fleeting moment that vanished. When fitted into the timeline, everything distorted. If Mrs. Pauline saw the man in brown at 5:47, why didn't anyone else see him later? Especially between 6:05 and 6:10, when the market area still had foot traffic. If the student saw someone next to Benjamin, why did the beachgoer say he only saw Benjamin, no one beside him? And if the bike was still there at 6:10 but no one saw Benjamin, it meant the boy left that spot in just a few short minutes. The gap from 6:10 to 6:25 became the biggest knot in the entire timeline. It was unnaturally silent, as if for those 15 minutes, Pine Hill Market ceased to exist in anyone's eyes. No one recalled a scream, no one saw a struggle, no one noticed anyone hurrying away. Locals said that afternoon was completely normal, with no notable sounds or movements. The police-constructed timeline was thus little more than a straight line with 3 bright points shrouded in thick darkness. Doyle and Lewis concluded that with no signs of struggle, no cries for help, no valuable physical evidence, and witness statements as hazy as fog, the theory that Benjamin left the area on his own seemed more reasonable than any serious scenario. But that very silence, the absolute emptiness during the time Benjamin vanished from all sight, made that timeline segment one of the most toxic in Clearwater history, where every clue sank as if sucked into the very peacefulness the town always prided itself on. And when the timeline was temporarily reconstructed with so many dark gaps that they could not be filled, Doyle and Lewis, while still holding the view that this might just be a case of a boy wandering off, were forced to activate the standard search procedure on the first night. Starting from Pine Hill Market, where Benjamin's red bicycle had once been present and then vanished without explanation, they began expanding the search radius 1 mile in all 4 directions. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the pavement, the gravel paths, the lawns, and the dark spaces between the rows of trees, but nothing reflected back except the familiar white sand and road dust of Clearwater. This town was too small and too peaceful for anyone to have ever imagined that a child could disappear in an instant. As the clock passed 9 p.m., many local residents, who had heard the news from neighbors or directly from Mary, volunteered to join the search. Some walked along the seaside park where kids often played ball in the afternoons. Others went down to the sandy shore, shining flashlights along the water's edge, in hopes of spotting small footprints. The rest fanned out into the trails leading north toward the railroad tracks, where the dusty ground could easily record any signs of movement if there had been any. But no matter how far they went, all they saw were their own footprints crossing over faint old ones, and the distant sound of waves echoing back as if mocking their efforts. No one found Benjamin, and no one found any item belonging to him, not a shoe, not a shopping receipt, not a scrap of clothing, nothing to provide direction. Everyone passing Pine Hill Market turned back to look at the area where the bicycle had been parked, as if hoping the flashlight beams would reveal an overlooked clue. But the planter had been trampled so much that it was impossible to distinguish old marks from new. The search party had no K9 units, no professional grid maps. They only had willpower, panic, and the sense that time was slipping away too quickly for a child to be found in the night. Meanwhile, Mary stood at the front door, glancing every few moments toward the road leading to the market, as she had done for years whenever Benjamin went to buy something for her. She clasped her hands together until her knuckles turned white, straining to hear any sound that might signal her son was running home. Edward paced between the yard and the gate, unable to stop, as if believing that if he just took a few more steps, he would hear the familiar sound of his son's bicycle approaching from somewhere. Every time a patrol car passed by, Mary leaned out onto the porch, hoping they brought good news, but their eyes, when looking at her, were all the same, tense, awkward, and lacking the certainty that was needed. Doyle stood at the main intersection, the temporary hub for the search party, marking a few checked areas with pencil on a crumpled sheet of paper. But those marked squares were too sparse and lacked any clear strategy. They were searching in the dark for something they weren't even sure had happened. As 10 p.m. passed, the temperature dropped, making the air bite into the skin. Volunteers who brought their pet dogs, though untrained, joined in. But the dogs only sniffed around the old scents from the store and found nothing leading to the boy. One group went up toward the railroad tracks, shining lights into every crevice between the wooden ties, but there was nothing but dried grease. Another group followed the rows of trees leading to the dirt road by the bay. They found a few large adult footprints, but couldn't be sure when they had appeared, whether they were related, and there was no protocol for collecting evidence. No one brought soil sample bags, no one took photos, No one recorded positions accurately. All were just desperate footsteps racing against the darkness. Police tried questioning workers who had just finished shifts at nearby stores, but most said they hadn't seen any child wandering around, and no one had noticed any suspicious strangers. Clearwater was a bayside town, where residents were mostly longtime families who knew each other. Strangers were truly the rarity among familiar faces. If an outsider had appeared, he might very well have slipped under the radar at the exact moment when everyone was busy with end-of-day tasks. By nearly 11 p.m., even though the search party had swept the entire southern park and the eastern seawall, all efforts returned to zero. No response when they called the boy's name. No signs of struggle. No dropped items along the way. No signal to guide the next step. Doyle wrote a brief note in the report. No evidence discovered indicating the boy was abducted. But behind that impersonal line was a chilling truth. They had no idea where Benjamin had gone or what had happened. The boy had been swallowed into nothingness, a thick darkness that dozens of flashlight beams still couldn't pierce. When the search had to be paused for the team to rest, Clearwater sank into a kind of silence the town had never known before. A silence so heavy it felt as if the very air was holding a secret that no one was ready to face. And it was in that uneasy quiet that officers Doyle and Lewis decided to return to Pine Hill Market the next morning to continue scanning the area, hoping daylight might reveal what the darkness had hidden. But the first thing they got was not physical evidence, but a cautious statement from the old man who delivered newspapers, the one who passed the market every afternoon on his old bicycle. He said that around nearly 6 p.m., he had seen a green pickup truck parked close to the curb right next to the wooden fence, in a position almost directly aligned with where Benjamin's red bicycle was usually parked. The old man described the truck as an old Ford from the late 1940s, moss green with a long bed, and remembered that the exhaust smoke was quite thick, a sign the engine was old or poorly maintained. However, he didn't see anyone inside the truck, nor did he know how long it had been parked there, as he only glanced over while focusing on sorting his stack of papers in the basket. When Doyle asked if he had seen the truck leave, the old man replied that when he came back about 5 minutes later, the truck was gone. This information caught Doyle's attention more than the vague statements from the previous night, because the presence of a strange vehicle right at the key location always had the potential to connect to a child's disappearance. But the lead quickly became more complicated when another witness, a woman who worked at the laundry shop behind the market, also confirmed seeing the shadow of a green truck pass by as she was locking the back door to leave around after 6:05 p.m. She didn't get a clear look at the license plate, didn't see the driver, and couldn't be sure it was the same truck the newspaper delivery man had seen. But the matching color made Doyle turn to a new page in his notebook. Clearwater and the surrounding area in 1954 was not a place where green Ford pickups were rare. Craftsmen, plumbers, loaders, or fishermen often used that type of vehicle to haul tools, and that was what made this lead both intriguing and suspicious, because the high frequency of such trucks made narrowing down the search exponentially harder. Within the next 24 hours, police began checking the registration list for green Ford pickups in all of Pinellas County. According to DMV records from that time, more than 30 vehicles matched the witnesses' descriptions, including 1948 F1S, 1950 F2S, and several 1951 F-Series models. The long list made what seemed like progress quickly stall into deadlock. Doyle and Lewis split up to visit each address, knocking on doors, asking each owner if they had passed Pine Hill Market that afternoon. The results: nearly all had clear alibis. One was at the harbor repairing a boat engine. Another was picking up his kid from baseball practice. One truck had been in the garage all afternoon, confirmed by neighbors. Some were even at repair shops with time-stamped invoices. Only 2 owners weren't home on the first visit, but when contacted, they both proved their whereabouts at the time of Benjamin's disappearance. One was attending a town council meeting. The other was in St. Petersburg visiting family. The checks dragged on for nearly 2.5 days, and every truck on the initial list was gradually crossed off. No license plates matched the descriptions, no owners had suspicious schedules, no one was recorded near Pine Hill Market in the critical window from 6 o'clock to 6:15. As the list dwindled, Doyle revisited the two witnesses' statements and began realizing that neither had actually seen the truck during the time Benjamin was confirmed to have left the store. The delivery man only caught a glimpse while stopped to sort papers, meaning he could have mistaken the time. The laundry worker only saw the truck's shadow in her peripheral vision, and it might have been just a fleeting impression. The fig tree where Mrs. Pauline saw the man standing was in a different direction from where the truck was said to be parked. If there was a connection, no witness had enough information to confirm it. Both descriptions could be accurate, but they could also be completely wrong. The only evidence, if it could be called that, was a paint color. When the report was sent up to supervisors, the conclusion was written clearly: green truck lead lacks reliability. No indication of direct connection to the disappearance. And so, despite mobilizing time, effort, and more than 30 direct contacts with owners, Clearwater Police could not turn that information into anything more useful than a vague possibility. In the investigation file, the note about the green pickup was marked in thin pencil, like a door that had barely opened before slamming shut. Potential lead: weak. That was the conclusion that left the Carter family utterly devastated, because they believed this could be the first thread to pull the case out of the maze. But instead, the green truck only pushed everything deeper into obscurity. A lid not wrong enough to discard, but not right enough to pursue, hanging between the fragmented memories of witnesses and the completely empty reality of the investigation. As Doyle left headquarters at the end of the day, the Clearwater sky turned deep purple. He stood under the porch, looking down the road stretching toward Pine Hill Market, and understood, though he didn't say it aloud, that the truck was not the key to unlocking the story, but merely an echo lost in an afternoon with too many voids to grasp. And when the brightest remaining lead was crossed off the suspect list, Doyle and Lewis were forced to return to square one in a state of exhaustion and impasse. In missing child cases of the 1950s, when all external directions closed off, investigators often turned inward to the very home the child had left from. The Carter family, who had just endured nearly 3 days of sleeplessness, anxiety, and despair, had no idea they were about to become the next subjects of investigation, simply due to the lack of clear leads from the scene. That morning, a patrol car pulled up in front of the Carter home, and Edward was asked to come to the station to go over his work timeline again. At first he thought it was just routine, but the atmosphere in the interview room made it clear they weren't treating this as a casual conversation. Doyle sat across from Edward, while Lewis stood behind taking notes. Edward was still wearing his grease-stained work clothes, his eyes ringed from 2 sleepless nights, but he tried to keep his gaze steady despite feeling confused. Doyle started with questions that had been asked many times before. What time did you leave work? Which route did you take home? Did anyone confirm that? Did you notice anything unusual that day? The questions repeated in loops, each loop sharper, more detailed, and every time Edward's answer varied slightly in minutes or location, Doyle leaned down to note it in a way that didn't hide his suspicion. Edward had stated he clocked out at 6:15, but the time card at the gas station showed 6:18, and that, though just a 3-minute difference due to an old clock being off or slow recording, prompted questions. Where were you during those 3 minutes? Doyle pressed, and Edward had to explain over and over that he was just washing his hands and changing out of his work shoes. But in the interview room, where every word was dissected, that explanation sounded like a gap. Then came the route he drove home. Edward said he took the main road, but a neighbor thought he saw Edward's car coming from a different direction. Though that discrepancy could easily be a witness mistake, or Edward being too stressed to remember accurately, it still became a thorn in the investigator's eyes. After more than 2 hours, Edward began sweating profusely, even though the room had fans running full blast. He couldn't understand why they were asking about these minor details instead of searching for his son. By the 3rd hour, Edward started losing patience, his voice breaking. I didn't do anything. I want you to find my son. Where is Benjamin? You have to find him. But that desperation didn't sway the rigid 1954 police procedure, which often viewed parents as potential suspects in unexplained cases. Into the fourth hour, Doyle shifted to an icy tone. Was there ever any conflict between you and Benjamin or Mary? Could the boy have run away because of something at home? Edward froze. He had never imagined being asked in this way, as if the pain of losing his child wasn't enough. Now he had to prove his own innocence. At the same time, back at home, Mary was being hit with questions from Officer Lewis that made her heart pound. Lewis didn't sit down like a guest. He stood right at the kitchen doorway, one hand on his notebook, asking in a flat voice, "Did you and Edward ever argue in front of Benjamin? Did the boy show any strange reactions? Did you ever punish him in a way that might make him want to run off?" Those questions landed on Mary like hammer blows on wood. Their home had tensions over money at times, disagreements over parenting at others, but nothing big enough to drive a child to leave. Mary tried to explain that Benjamin was a shy kid, terrified of disappointing his parents, and incapable of leaving on his own accord. But the more she explained, the more Lewis wrote. The more he asked questions suggesting Benjamin might have wanted to escape the home atmosphere. Mary felt suffocated, as if every answer was being twisted against her family. When she insisted Benjamin had never run away or defied them, Lewis replied in an overly calm voice, "Most runaway cases happen the first time without parents expecting it." That statement left Mary standing frozen. In her mind, each syllable fell like a cold cut. The police didn't believe her son had been taken. They thought he ran away. They were looking for reasons to classify the case as non-serious. Edward's interview ended after 4 hours with no point in his statement qualifying as incriminating evidence. Both officers had to admit there was nothing linking Edward to Benjamin's disappearance, except he was the boy's father, and had a few minor time discrepancies due to panic. Mary was also cleared of any violent behavior, serious family conflict, and all neighbors described the Carters as an exemplary family. But that half-day, 12 hours, had been spent solely on police trying to see if the parents were the perpetrators. The two officers finally noted, no evidence found against the parents. Still, the most frightening part wasn't the suspicion, but the time. The golden 48 hours, the critical window in any child disappearance, had been wasted on asking the wrong questions, drilling into non-essential discrepancies, pursuing directions that didn't advance the case 1 inch. Meanwhile, any real traces out there, if they still existed, were cooling hour by hour, and Benjamin, a 9-year-old boy with gentle gray eyes, remained completely vanished in Clearwater, as if he had never existed. When the investigation direction toward the Carter family was finally abandoned after nearly 2 days of fruitless circling, Officers Doyle and Lewis were forced to return to Pine Hill Market once again. This time with weary eyes, but also more bitter ones, because they understood that every clue, no matter how small, had to be re-examined. What they had missed on the first night could be the only thing left amid the countless dark gaps in Benjamin's timeline. That morning, the Florida sunlight shone down on the concrete pavement, making everything clearer, and it was thanks to that light that a volunteer, who still returned to the area every day searching for signs, discovered what the police should have seen from the very first night: a man's shoe print, imprinted quite deeply in the thin layer of sand, right next to the planter area, just a few steps from the store. The shoe print veered off toward the small alley on the right side of Pine Hill Market, a spot that few locals paid attention to because at night it was almost completely shrouded in shadow. Doyle and Lewis approached to examine it, and in the very first moment of observation, they knew this was not the shoe print of any member of the Carter family. Mary wore low-heeled shoes, Edward wore old work shoes, worn down at the heels, and Benjamin wore small rubber sandals. This print was completely unlike any of those. This was the mark of an adult man, with a large sole, deep grooves, typical of labor style or forest boot style, commonly used by hunters or workers in rougher environments rather than a small seaside town like Clearwater. The foot impression was uneven, as if the person had stepped heavily on one foot, possibly due to heavy weight or haste when turning direction. But instead of cordoning off the area, as standard investigative procedure, instead of taking photos, marking it, or placing a protective frame to preserve the ground, Doyle only bent down to examine it for a few seconds, then stood up with an expression not fully convinced that the shoe print held real value. He noted in his notebook a few lines about a large unidentified footprint, but took no steps whatsoever to preserve it. The sad thing was, they had arrived too late. The shoe print was no longer intact. The upper edge had been filled in by wind-blown sand, the lower edge lightly stepped on by a woman passing by, distorting half the print. If they had come on the first night before the crowds gathered, before dozens of feet inadvertently erased the ground, the shoe print could have become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. When Lewis roughly measured the print length with a pencil, he estimated the shoe size equivalent to 11 or 12, relatively large for men in that era. That figure immediately ruled out the possibility it was a boy's print. But instead of making the police more alert, they assumed the market was always busy with foot traffic, and the print could belong to anyone who stopped by to shop that day. That reasoning was not wrong, but it was also not right, because the print's location was not on the main walkway. It was right next to the planter, where few people lingered, and it was the only spot close to where Benjamin's bicycle had last been parked. This place was entirely possible as a point of interaction between the boy and someone else, but in the 1950s police mindset, everything still leaned toward the wandered-off hypothesis, more than led away or forced away. A large man standing in a spot not on the main path, right next to where the bicycle had been, during the time the boy vanished, that should have been a blazing red flag. But when Doyle stood up and brushed the dust off his hands, he only wrote in his notebook 3 lightly underlined words. Unconfirmed footprint, no photos taken, no soil samples collected, no precise measurements, no comparison with anyone's shoes. When the market manager asked if the shoe print was important, Doyle only replied, "Hard to say, could just be someone who parked nearby." And with such a casual remark, what was perhaps the most important clue in the early stage was pushed to the margins of the file. The end-of-day report only recorded a brief note. Footprint, adult male location uncertain, potential lead, no further action. Without any modern investigative knowledge, one could still recognize this as a sign that the police overlooked the possibility of direct contact with Benjamin at the time he disappeared. The volunteers who heard about the shoe print discovery all felt uneasy, but since the investigation was entirely under police authority, they could do nothing but continue circling the area in hopes of finding something clearer. But as on previous nights, they only found silent emptiness and the sound of their own footsteps. Mary was not told about the shoe print right away, and when the information reached her through scattered accounts from acquaintances, her heart tightened. A strange shoe print near where her son had last stood, it was like a fleeting call from somewhere far away, a sign that Benjamin might have gone with someone rather than leaving on his own. But because the shoe print was not properly collected, it quickly faded, becoming a worthless shadow in the case file, just a note buried among countless details overlooked in the chaotic early days. From today's perspective, that shoe print was like a door that had cracked open wide enough to step through, but was closed due to subjectivity and lack of experience. In the official records of the Clearwater Police, it was neatly labeled with 3 cold words, "Overlooked clue." And when the strange shoe print was set aside as an insufficiently significant detail, the Clearwater Police Department was forced to rely again on the only remaining source of information, witnesses. But when Doyle and Lewis began going back to each person for second statements, they soon realized something unexpected. The new accounts were even more vague, skewed, and chaotic than what they had gathered on the first night. The first witness they re-interviewed was the old newspaper delivery man, the one who had mentioned the green truck and who habitually passed by Pine Hill Market every afternoon. This time, when Doyle asked in detail about the time he saw the truck, the old man said it might have been around 6:15, not before 6 o'clock, as he had previously stated. When asked why the change, He honestly replied that he wasn't sure anymore, because lately he had been sleeping little and might have mixed up the times in his head. That answer was understandable, as the community's turmoil in the days since Benjamin's disappearance had distorted time for many people. However, for an investigation that relied on every minute and second, the witness shifting the time frame made the entire hypothesis around the green truck even shakier. When the police re-asked Mrs. Pauline about the man in the brown coat she said she saw under the banyan tree, she also began to falter. Previously, she had been certain he was standing near the tree trunk and watching Benjamin. But this time, she no longer dared to confirm that his gaze was truly directed at the boy or just toward the road. And when Lewis asked how tall he was, she guessed maybe 5'10", but a few minutes later said, maybe taller, then actually the shade covered his face. I'm not sure. Mrs. Pauline had been the first witness to offer hope of identifying a stranger near Benjamin. But now the details she had confidently provided fell into a hazy state like late afternoon sunlight. The police continued to the waitress at the nearby diner, the one who had stated she saw the red bicycle at 6:10. But when re-questioned, she was no longer sure if it was 6:10 or 6:15, because she had glanced at the wall clock in the laundromat before locking up, and it might have been running a few minutes slow. When Lewis asked her to describe the bicycle in more detail, she said, it might not have been bright red, but more maroon, or maybe the lights changed the color. Such small details thickened the wall of fog enveloping the entire case. With each witness re-interviewed, the initially faint memories became even more distorted, and worse, this spread quickly through the community like a chain reaction. The neighborhood children, who were a sensitive but unavoidable source of information, began telling stories that sounded half real, half imagined, each in their own way. One boy said he saw a man pulling Benjamin away, but when asked what the man was wearing, the boy said, "Don't remember." The girl next door said she saw Benjamin running toward the park, but then said she might have confused him with another child. A group of kids playing near the store even embellished a story that Benjamin was called into a car, but when police asked the car's color, one said green, one said gray, one said black. None were sure if they had actually seen it or just heard others talk and imagined it. This spreading was not intentional. It was the familiar reaction of young children when the whole neighborhood suddenly fell into panic. They tried to piece together scattered images in their minds into something meaningful, but that very act made the information more chaotic. Adults were no better. Some said they saw a man standing at the end of the road, but couldn't remember the exact time. Another insisted they saw someone's shadow running fast, but didn't know if it was a child or an adult. An elderly woman claimed to hear a truck engine starting around 6:20, but when asked which direction it went, she said, "Don't remember, because I was talking to my granddaughter at the time." All shared a common trait. Every additional question caused their memory to shift further. Doyle noticed this while taking notes, but he had no way to fix it, because what they were facing was not deliberate lying, but the distortion of human memory under collective pressure. Clearwater was a small town, and news of Benjamin's disappearance spread faster than any official call. When people started guessing, their memories began blending what they had truly seen with what they heard from others. A child would say something, even if inaccurate, and an hour later it became someone heard from 3 or 4 others. The police recorded everything, but the more they recorded, the more they saw the timeline stretched into a tangled mess, like a ball of yarn dropped from a table to the floor. The already vague timing became even more warped by each person's memory. Descriptions of the stranger were duplicated, tripled, then completely vanished when probed deeper. A man in a brown coat suddenly became a man in gray in another's account, then in a third child's words, became a person in dark clothing. When Doyle and Lewis compiled all the second and third statements, they realized a truth more frightening than any suspect. No statement was solid enough to verify. They wanted to reconstruct Benjamin's path, but the memory fragments provided were like shattered glass pieces shuffled together, overlapping but unable to form a complete picture. From an investigative viewpoint, this was the phase where the case began slipping out of reach. When witnesses continuously changed their statements, when the community began retelling the story based on faint memories mixed with rumors, and when there was no physical evidence to cling to, the police fell into a situation where every step was like treading in mud. The harder they tried to advance, the deeper they sank into chaos. By the end of the day, when Doyle signed the report, the words he wrote were almost a confession of absolute deadlock. Unable to verify any statements, witnesses lack reliability. Unable to determine what occurred after 6:10 p.m. In that context, Benjamin's disappearance no longer resembled a typical missing person case. It became a shapeless haze, enveloped by drifting memories, stories colliding, then separating, and helplessness spreading through every beat of Clearwater's investigation. Amid the leads around Pine Hill Market, gradually dissolving into the thick fog of contradictions and confusion, an unexpected piece of information emerged, not from Clearwater residents, but from a hunter living more than 40 miles from town, near the edge of Ocala National Forest, the vast forest stretching hundreds of square miles in central Florida. His name was Harold Keene, 62 years old, a longtime hunter who frequently entered Ocala to set rabbit traps and hunt wild turkeys. That morning, he drove his old pickup to the Clearwater Police Headquarters, his sun-tanned face and eyes always squinted as if peering through something. He came not because he knew Benjamin or the Carter family, but only because he had heard about the disappearance on local radio. What he said made Lewis stop writing. "I heard a child crying in the forest, about a week ago." Doyle immediately asked, "A week? Where? Are you sure it was a child's cry?" Harold nodded, but explained in the slow, somewhat cautious manner of someone long accustomed to living alone. "I was setting traps near the eastern edge of Ocala. As the sun was nearly setting, I heard a sound like a child's choked crying, not an animal sound. It sounded like a very weak call, like from deeper in the brush." Doyle asked more about the location, and Harold described that the crying echoed from the direction of an abandoned cabin about half a mile off the trail. He had been to that area a few times to check traps, but the cabin was always sealed, and he assumed no one had lived there for years. When he heard the child's cry, he stood still and quiet for a moment to listen. But the sound stopped abruptly after a few dozen seconds. He thought it might be an echo from far away, or a prank by some teenagers, so he didn't go deeper. At that time, he made no connection to the Clearwater disappearance, as the case hadn't been widely broadcast on radio yet. Doyle frowned. Ocala was quite far from Clearwater. Nearly 60 kilometers was not a distance a 9-year-old child could travel alone, especially in the short timeline they had. But what made Harold's account impossible to dismiss easily was the way he described the crying, not panicked, not screaming loudly, but choked and weak, as if from someone exhausted. That made Mary, who was sitting in the outer waiting room, go pale when she overheard snippets, though not every word. Lewis recorded every detail, but right after, both officers fell into hesitation. Clearwater was a coastal town. Ocala was deep inland. No witness in town had seen Benjamin leave the market area or get into anyone's vehicle. The green truck, the only potentially related clue, had been crossed off the list. And most importantly, in the 1954 police mindset, missing children were rarely taken far away in just a few hours. Most cases were viewed as defying parents or playing too long. Doyle looked at Harold, then at his notes, and finally said in a voice trying to maintain an officer's politeness, "You might have mistaken an animal sound or wind in the treetops. Ocala Forest is vast and deep, full of echoes." Harold didn't argue, just shrugged. "I've lived in the woods my whole life. I know animal sounds, I know wind sounds. That wasn't like them. But anyway, I just came to report it," and he stood up, nodded slightly, then left the headquarters with heavy steps, as if knowing in advance that what he said would be downplayed. After he left, Doyle sighed and underlined the note, "Unverified clue possibly imagined." Lewis was more practical. Even if the crying was real, It couldn't be Benjamin. There's no evidence the boy left Clearwater. Then they dismissed the information as an oddity, one of those quirky things people living near the forest sometimes report to police. But there was one thing neither knew and couldn't know, that Ocala Forest was vast enough to swallow any sound if it didn't last long enough to draw attention. And the abandoned cabin Harold described did exist, deeper inside, where no one on the night of the disappearance thought to look. Thus, although his statement was the first real clue leading outside Clearwater to a distant but not unreasonable location, it was treated as a fanciful tale from an old suspicious hunter. No search team was dispatched to Ocala. No area maps were pulled out. No one marked the cabin's location. Everything related to that statement was simply filed at the end of the report under a dry heading, "Child crying in forest, unreliable, no follow-up." And so, a door leading to secrets deep in the Florida woods closed without ever being opened. As that entire day passed without any new information, Doyle felt the case slipping into a void, colder than the dark gaps in Benjamin's timeline. And Mary, still clinging to hope that police would call with something, even the smallest news, only received thickening silence, a heavy silence, as if it itself was swallowing her last bits of hope. And precisely downplaying the report from Ocala, just because it lay outside what they deemed reasonable, pushed the case fully into the phase no one dared name deadlock. A week had passed since the afternoon Benjamin vanished from Pine Hill Market, and the report of a child crying in the Ocala forest, the only lead that opened an investigative direction beyond Clearwater, had been pushed to the bottom of the file, no different from a meaningless echo in the vast emptiness. With no new information, with witnesses constantly changing their stories, with the shoe print overlooked, the green truck leading nowhere, and every trace seemingly swept away by the sea, the Clearwater Police Department began to fall into a state of collective fatigue. Doyle and Lewis, the two officers most attached to the case from the beginning, sat at the conference table on Saturday morning, facing a pile of paperwork, but none of it held any real value. That emptiness, combined with several sleepless nights, led them to a conclusion that would later become one of the biggest mistakes in the investigation. Benjamin Carter might have run away on his own. Their reasoning was based on 3 points. First, no one saw the boy being forced. Second, there were no signs of a struggle or physical evidence indicating a crime. And third, children sometimes run away from home for reasons their parents never know. This sounded reasonable in a town that believed every tragedy had to have a clear event, rather than happening silently, like darkness swallowing a child. But that conclusion was not only wrong, it was cruel. Mary heard the news directly from Doyle when he came to the house to update the search results on that Saturday. She stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the table, her face shifting from fear to disbelief, then to anger in just a few seconds. "My son didn't run away," she said, her voice trembling but ice cold. "He's afraid of the dark, he's afraid of going far, and he would never leave the house without telling me." Edward stood beside her, silent in a way that was terrifying. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, from pain, and from the thought that the police, the only ones with the power and ability to find Benjamin, were starting to turn their backs. But their objections changed nothing. When Doyle left, he had given an oral order, reduced the number of officers on search patrols by half, cut the nighttime sweep teams, and stop expanding the search beyond a 2-mile radius. With the conclusion of no evidence of a crime, they could no longer request additional resources from Pinellas County. And in the 1950s, local police operated on limited budgets once a case was no longer considered urgent. All support dried up like an oil lamp running out of wick. The news spread through the community so quickly that within a day, the number of volunteers showing up to help search had halved. Some people even whispered to each other that Benjamin might have been upset about family issues or something at school and run away. Others believed the boy had slipped and fallen into the sea, his body carried far out by the waves, an idea that made a few shudder but was easier to accept than the thought of a stranger abducting him right in the middle of town. But to Mary, every such word, was like a knife cut. She knew her son better than anyone. Benjamin was not the type of child to run away on his own, and certainly not one who could go far enough to never be found. He was so shy that he was afraid to go to the park alone without a friend. He feared the beach at dusk because of the big waves, and he was especially afraid of the noisy bustle of the market on crowded afternoons. Nothing, not a single piece of his personality, fit the police's newly constructed hypothesis. But the parents' pain no longer mattered when the investigation file shifted to the reduced search intensity category. Officers were reassigned to handle other incidents in town. Patrol cars now only drove past Pine Hill Market as a formality. The nights before, flashlight beams had swept along the beach like rays of hope. But now the beach returned to its quiet state, with only a few people strolling. The dirt roads leading to the railroad tracks, once continuously searched, now bore no new footprints. The park where children played every afternoon echoed with laughter again as before, but no one mentioned Benjamin except in passing questions. And the Carter family was exhausted. Mary could no longer sleep. Every night she lay wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind through the trees, and imagining it as footsteps. She kept Benjamin's shirt right beside her pillow so she could smell him, as a way to cling to reality. Edward became more withdrawn. He retreated into silence, drinking coffee instead of sleeping, wandering around the house at midnight, just to feel like he was doing something. The small house that had always been warm now became an empty shell, cold and choked. Saturday passed, then the 8th day, the 9th. Each day, the fear in the Carter family grew a little more, while the police presence around the search area dwindled like a battery running low. When Doyle submitted the weekend report to the chief, the final conclusion line, written in neat but indifferent handwriting, officially closed the active search phase of the case. No evidence of crime, the boy may have run away voluntarily. With that erroneous conclusion, the Benjamin Carter case slipped from Clearwater's grasp, falling into a darkness longer than anyone in the town had ever imagined. And just as the conclusion that Benjamin may have run away was firmly recorded in the file, the search force began to withdraw gradually, and the Carter family's hope flickered like a candle about to go out in the Florida night wind. Then unexpectedly, late pieces of evidence, fragments that should have appeared in the first days, floated back into the case, like untimely signals from the past. One morning nearly 10 days after Benjamin disappeared, a farmer named Walter Briggs, living on the northern edge of Clearwater, near the area connecting to the dirt road, leading to the edge of a small forest bordering the swampy region, accidentally discovered a small piece of fabric caught on a low branch while walking his hunting dog along the fence. He bent down, pulled it off, and immediately recognized it as the kind of fabric from children's clothing, soft cotton, faded light blue, with a ragged torn edge, as if it had been forcefully pulled from the original garment. Since the disappearance had spread throughout the town, he immediately took the piece of fabric to report to the Clearwater police. When Doyle received the information, he only slightly frowned. The area was far from Pine Hill Market, outside the initial search radius, but the fabric, even though small, was worth noting. However, when he and Lewis arrived to examine the scene, the first thing they saw was not the fabric, but large shoe prints, dog paw prints, and overlapping tire tracks everywhere. The area had been completely disturbed before they arrived. Walter hadn't intentionally contaminated the scene. He simply walked his dog every morning, and the fabric was right next to the path that dozens of local residents passed daily. Doyle picked up the fabric, examined it in the sunlight, but instead of sealing off the location, taking photos, measuring directions, or collecting soil samples, he simply placed the fabric in a thin paper evidence bag and nodded in thanks to Walter. The same approach, quick and efficient, but lacking any preservation procedures. When he asked Mary if Benjamin had any shirt in a similar color, Mary took a few minutes to try to recall the contents of her son's wardrobe, then said Benjamin had a light blue shirt, but wasn't sure if the fabric was related. This wasn't because she didn't remember, but because the piece was too small, barely 2 inches by 3 inches, not enough to determine what type of clothing it came from. But that wasn't the only evidence. That same afternoon, about 300 meters from the fabric's location, a boy catching insects in thick grass discovered a small handkerchief, the kind children often carried to school. It was white, with a simple embroidered sailboat border, and one corner had dried mud. The boy took the handkerchief home to his mother, and only when the mother heard about the morning's fabric did she hurriedly bring the handkerchief to the police station to turn it in. When the handkerchief was placed on the intake desk, Mary, who was there for a brief discussion, immediately recognized the familiar embroidery. Benjamin had a handkerchief like this, a birthday gift from his aunt in Tampa. But when Doyle asked, "Are you sure this belongs to your son?" Mary fell silent. Benjamin's handkerchief had her writing BC on the edge in blue ink, but the edge of the evidence handkerchief was torn off, leaving only the sailboat embroidery. No name, no clear identifying feature, and certainly no scientific methods in 1954 to analyze fibers or fingerprints. No DNA, no histological testing, no fiber origin determination, all beyond the capabilities of police at the time. The handkerchief was sealed, but only as a formality. When placed next to the morning's fabric, they tried to see if the two pieces of evidence had any similarities in material or color. But the blue fabric and white handkerchief showed no clear connection, and since no other traces were found around the discovery area, the two pieces of evidence remained in limbo, suspicious yet not weighty enough to become a lead. In the internal report, Lewis noted, "Child's handkerchief relation unclear, piece of fabric, cannot confirm belonging to victim. Insufficient basis to expand investigation." In other words, the two pieces of evidence were filed under uncertain, not prioritized, not cross-referenced, and generated no further action. What made it all the more regrettable was the location where the two pieces were found, right at the edge of the small forest heading north, which in many later missing child cases, police learned was where abducted children often left drop traces. But in 1954, concepts like criminal behavior analysis or perpetrator movement mapping did not exist. When a strong wind blew, the fabric on the branch swayed as if trying to signal something, but no one could read it. The fabric was overlooked, the handkerchief sealed but not analyzed, and both became misfit pieces, arriving too late, examined too superficially, then recorded in the file as a faint footnote no one remembered. When Mary heard the news, she felt as if someone had sucked all the air from her chest. She wanted to scream that the handkerchief was Benjamin's, that the fabric might be the only clue leading to her son, but she had no proof. And in an investigation that operated only by cold procedures, a mother's intuition was never given enough weight to be heard. At the end of that day, Doyle closed the evidence section with a brief note. Investigative value, undetermined. And that line, more than anything else, wore down the Carter family's hope layer by layer, like that tiny piece of fabric, torn, isolated, and forgotten, just when it most needed to be recognized. And then, when the piece of fabric and the handkerchief, the only two pieces of evidence to appear after more than 10 days, were directly filed under insufficient investigative value, the Carter family still clung to the thought that the police would eventually change their view. But that fragile hope was immediately crushed when the Florida press entered the fray faster than any progress from the investigating agency. Just 2 days after the police issued their preliminary conclusion of no evidence of crime, the Clearwater Sun and a few local papers ran large headlines in the same direction. 9-year-old boy may have run away, no signs of abduction. These articles not only summarized the police conclusion, but added speculative arguments, making it easy for readers to believe Benjamin had run away due to family conflict or sensitive temperament. One paper even quoted an anonymous source, claiming the Carter family had internal pressures. No one knew who the source was, but it was enough to push public opinion in a wrong, cruel direction. Mary read the article on a gloomy morning, the paper trembling in her hands until the edges crumpled. The bold headline, "Benjamin may just be hiding at a friend's house," stunned her more than the pain of those first nights when her son went missing. She knew Benjamin, knew his fear of the dark, knew his shyness, knew he would never go far from home without telling his mother. But the public didn't know that. They only knew what the press printed, and the press, in an era without clear modern ethical standards, often chose sensationalism over caution. It didn't take long for the Clearwater community, small, close-knit but easily swayed by rumors, to start looking at the Carter family differently. Some previously close neighbors, when passing the Carter house, began avoiding Mary's eyes. A few whispered to each other in front of the school, there must have been something going on at home for the boy to leave like that, or if they had watched him more closely, this wouldn't have happened. Their suggestive silence stabbed Mary like small but constant needles, making her afraid to step outside unless absolutely necessary. Edward was not spared the judgment either. At the gas station where he worked, some regular customers began asking questions, half pitying, half suspicious. "You're sure there wasn't anything between you and the boy, right? Or kids run away often because parents are too strict." Many didn't mean to hurt. They were just repeating what the press suggested. But to Edward, a man who always endured in silence, each word added another brick around his heart, gradually isolating him in his own life. When Mary went to church to pray, a habit she had kept since Benjamin was born, she clearly felt the averted gazes. A group of women standing near the door waited for her to pass before lowering their voices. "Poor thing, but clearly they had issues," another added. "Otherwise the boy wouldn't have run away." Those words made Mary freeze, feeling as if time had solidified around her. She didn't blame them. She just no longer had the strength to fight each judgmental stone falling on her. That isolation didn't only come from outsiders. It also crept into the life between Mary and Edward. The couple who once talked for hours about Benjamin's dreams, about the boy's future, now only looked at each other with eyes full of anxiety, each trying to hide their inner brokenness so as not to make the other collapse further. As the press continued running stories in the no signs of abduction direction, the police no longer faced pressure to expand the investigation. The Clearwater Police Department used the press itself as evidence to reinforce their decision to scale back the search. And like a vicious cycle, the press relied on the police conclusion, while the police relied on the press's support to avoid opening new directions. The public read the papers and judged the Carter family, and that very thing pushed Mary and Edward into a darkness they had never imagined, suspicion from the community they had lived in their whole lives. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Some said Benjamin was bullied and ran away. Others claimed the boy wanted to find his real father because apparently Edward wasn't his biological dad. A baseless rumor, but one that spread widely simply because of the gaps in the case. When Mary heard that rumor, she broke down sobbing so violently that she collapsed in the living room, and Edward had to hold her tightly to keep her from fainting. Nothing hurt more than being indirectly accused by their own community of causing their son's loss, especially while they were trying to survive hour by hour with hearts heavy from a pain that couldn't be named. The Carter house, once filled with Benjamin's laughter, now became a home with windows always shut, curtains always drawn low, as if trying to protect itself from the outside world. But no curtain was thick enough to block the gossip from reaching their ears. When Doyle drove past the Carter house during his shift and saw the house completely dark, he felt a fleeting sense of guilt, very small but real, because he knew, though he didn't say it, that the police's scaled-back investigation and initial wrong conclusion had contributed to pushing public opinion against the family. But that feeling was quickly swallowed by fatigue and the defensive mechanism of an officer accustomed to unfinished cases. That week, the press continued emphasizing the runaway hypothesis, and the Carter family's shattered trust became complete. They no longer believed the police would find their son, no longer believed the community would stand by them. And the saddest thing, their lifelong faith in the safety of the town shattered as well. As the press continued to delve deeply into the hypothesis that Benjamin left on his own, and the Clearwater community gradually turned its back on the Carter family, the case crossed the fragile boundary between hope and despair, plunging straight into the silence of the investigative machinery. In early 1955, after nearly 8 months without any new statements, physical evidence, or information, the Clearwater Police Department officially classified the Benjamin Carter case as unsolved, no further leads, and the file was placed in a cold metal cabinet in the storage room, like dozens of other cases swallowed by time. Doyle signed the final report with weary handwriting, while Lewis only sighed, not daring to look at Mary when informing her of the decision. For the police, the case had reached the limit of what they could do. For the Carter family, it was the moment that severed the last thread, connecting them to the hope that someone in the justice system would continue searching for Benjamin. And from that moment on, what happened next no longer came from the investigation files, but from the silent cracks within what was once the warmest home in Clearwater. Edward Carter, who had tried to stay strong through the early days of searching, through the hours of interrogation, through the neighbors' suspicion, began carrying within him a growing obsession. He believed that he himself had lost the critical moment, that the 3-minute discrepancy in the time clock, that the route home he couldn't recall precisely, that his failure to stop Benjamin from going to the store had made the boy disappear forever. That obsession didn't make him shout or lash out. On the contrary, it made him quieter day by day. He spoke less, slept less, and whenever he heard children's voices outside, he closed the door. That silence seeped into meals, into every room, into the evenings when Mary sat under the yellow lamp, waiting for the sound of Benjamin's bicycle. In the summer of 1957, the city began to transform with Florida's development pace, but the Carter house took one step back, then another. Finally, one September night, Edward packed a few clothes, held his wedding ring in his hand for a long time before placing it back on the table, and wrote Mary a short note with just 9 words. "I can't stay here when he's gone." The next morning, Mary found the note on the kitchen table, and Edward's coffee cup still half full, its steam long gone. He left Clearwater without a goodbye, without a clear destination. A few people said they saw him in Jacksonville a few months later, then heard he appeared in Gainesville, but no one knew for sure. He became a wandering shadow among Florida's towns, carrying a guilt he never voiced. Mary didn't blame him, but in that moment, standing alone in the empty kitchen, she understood that losing Benjamin was the first blow, and losing Edward was the second that caused the house to collapse from within. Yet Mary never left Clearwater. She turned Benjamin's bedroom into a sacred place, keeping everything exactly as it was: the small bed with its blue blanket, the bookshelf with old adventure stories, the tin toy truck he loved so much, and the shirt she had ironed the night before he disappeared. She didn't let anyone enter the room, didn't let anyone clean it, because for her, that room was proof that her son still existed, that the boy could walk through the door at any moment and find everything just as he left it. In the years that followed, Clearwater grew rapidly. Roads were widened, new houses built, the beach became a tourist attraction drawing visitors. But in the house on Bayview Street, time seemed frozen. Mary still went to work, still greeted neighbors with a faint smile, but everyone could see in her eyes a faded light, the light of someone living on a single fragile hope that one day Benjamin would be found. And even though the press had stopped mentioning the case, the community had stopped talking about it, and most people viewed it as a sad chapter long closed, Mary refused to let the case be forgotten. She wrote to the police once a year, asking if there was any new information, though the answer was always the same: no. From 1955 to 1970, not a single new statement appeared. No one reported seeing Benjamin in another town. No additional physical evidence was found. No child appeared in another state matching his description. No late witnesses came forward. The case file lay in an old cabinet at the police station, labeled on the cover Carter, Benjamin, missing juvenile, 1954, gathering thick dust. Doyle retired at the end of the 1960s. Lewis was transferred to another department. Younger officers replaced them, but none cared enough about a disappearance so long ago. Clearwater changed, but the word unsolved in the file remained. cold and indifferent. In those years, the pain no longer had the sharp edges of the early days. It became a thin mist, covering Mary's life, not making her cry every day, but always present like breath. She lived, but couldn't escape the cycle of hope and disappointment. Whenever she heard news of a missing child found nearby, her heart tightened before realizing it wasn't Benjamin. She aged, but the pain did not. It stayed fixed in 1954, dragging her life into a past she couldn't leave. And so from 1955 to 1970, the Benjamin Carter case lay still, like a waveless lake, undisturbed, with no clues, no miracles. Only Mary, the only mother in town, kept her son's room lit every night, as a reminder to herself that even if the world had forgotten, she never would. While the case file was locked tight in a metal cabinet at the Clearwater Police Department, and Mary's life hung suspended in years of hopeless waiting, in a place very far away, so far that no one could imagine, there was a wooden cabin deep in the Florida woods, where the dust of Clearwater's roads could never reach, and the coastal sunlight could never penetrate the thick layers of trees. The cabin was small, old, smelling of damp wood and spilled gasoline around the porch, as if the place was never meant for human life. In the darkness of that cabin, Benjamin Carter, the child who vanished from Pine Hill Market on a June afternoon, existed like a shadow unknown to anyone. He didn't know how many days he had been there. He didn't know where the cabin was, or which way the door faced, or when the man's shadow appeared or disappeared. The only thing he knew, from the very first moment, was the sound of the lock. That sound was sharp, cold, echoing off the wooden walls and bouncing into his ears like metal falling into a deep well. There were no soothing words, no explanations. Only the lock and the movement of the man's shadow, heavy, slow, faceless. The cabin had only one dangling yellow bulb, its light so weak that Benjamin could never clearly see the ceiling. It flickered when the man opened the door, flickered when he walked, flickered even without wind, as if the cabin itself was breathing, pulsing with the fear of the child inside. The pine walls absorbed moisture, making the cabin always damp and cold. Every time Benjamin lay down, the wood let out a small creak like a groan. He didn't know if it was day or night. No outside light ever seeped in. Time became endlessly long, without boundaries. When he opened his eyes, the cabin was still yellowish. When he closed them, it was still yellowish. The only change was the regular turning of the key, the sole marker for Benjamin that the outside world still existed. He vaguely remembered the first moments being brought here. There seemed to be the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, gasoline, the man's sweat. The cabin seemed to shake slightly, as if he was being carried from a vehicle. There seemed to be the sound of water, not the familiar ocean waves of Clearwater, but heavy, slow water, like swamp bubbles breaking on a lake surface. And in a few brief moments, he heard alligators, that low, dry croak he had once heard when his father took him camping near the Withlacoochee River. That sound made him understand, vaguely, that this place was very far, far from everything he knew. The first time he opened his eyes in the cabin, the bottom of his pants still had sand from Pine Hill Market. He remembered turning his head, calling Mom, but his voice was swallowed by the cabin, sinking into the dark cracks. From then on, his calls grew quieter, until only whispers in his throat remained. Every time the man opened the door, the yellow bulb's light illuminated half his face, but not enough for Benjamin to recognize anyone. He only saw the shadow of a hat, the outline of a chin, the large muddy boots that made a heavy thud with every step on the wooden floor. He heard the man's breathing, uneven, sometimes hurried, sometimes long. He never spoke much. When he placed food on the floor, Benjamin backed into the corner, eyes wide. He only ever said one sentence, unclear if to the boy or to himself, quiet, just that. One word. Then the lock sounded again. Benjamin didn't know where the man went when he left. He only heard footsteps sinking into damp soil, the clank of metal against his side, as if something heavy was carried. That sound gradually faded into the forest noises, the drone of insects dripping water, something crawling in the night. sometimes rustling, not from the cabin, but from outside, from the swamp's edge. Sometimes it was loud enough that Benjamin buried his face in his knees, covering his ears, but unable to block the feeling that something was dragging itself very close to the cabin, possibly brushing against the wall at any moment. Every time the cabin shook slightly, he didn't know if it was wind, the man returning, or a large animal passing by. He only knew his heart pounded tightly, pounding so hard he could hear it in his chest, a thumping like knocking on wood. Sometimes the cabin was so dark, Benjamin thought the light had gone out. But then it flickered, illuminating one image he remembered clearly, the wooden door. The wooden door had a long scratch, like claw marks from someone who had tried to dig. He didn't dare touch it. Every time the flickering light highlighted the scratch, he imagined someone's trembling, desperate fingers had left it. Sometimes Benjamin dozed off without knowing how long he had slept. When he opened his eyes, the cabin was unchanged. When he closed them, unchanged. Only the feeling in his body changed: hunger, cold, dizziness from lack of light. Once he was so exhausted, he couldn't cry anymore. His throat was dry, like swallowing sand. When water was placed on the floor, he didn't remember drinking, only the metallic taste from stagnant bucket water. Some days, or perhaps just the feeling of days, he heard water lapping against something hard, steadily, repeating every few seconds. That sound wasn't like ocean waves, it was deeper, thicker. Every time it sounded, the cabin shook slightly. And Benjamin imagined the cabin was near a swamp bank, where water slapped against roots, where alligators swam by. Sometimes, that sound blended with his breathing, making sleep so hazy he thought he was floating in a small wooden box adrift on water. As time passed, Benjamin no longer thought of days, months, or things he used to do with his mother. The bright initial memories, like Pine Hill Market, like the red bicycle, like Mary's smile, faded gradually, replaced by fragmented images: the yellow bulb, the wooden door, the lock sound, alligator croaks, water sounds, heavy boots thudding on wood, the cabin's damp stench. He couldn't remember the man's voice, but remembered the hands, large, bony, rough, with blue veins bulging when placing food. Not threatening, not gentle, just cold. The only moments Benjamin felt his own existence were when the cabin was so silent he heard his heartbeat in his ears, or when he touched the wooden floor and felt it warm from his own body. Heat. Fragile proof that he was still there. In that cabin, Benjamin no longer called anyone's name. He didn't know how long he would be there, nor what there even meant. Only the cabin, only the man's shadow, only the forest sounds. And him, a 9-year-old child, drifting in darkness without knowing how long he existed, or if anyone was looking for him. To him, the world was now just moldy wooden walls, sickly yellow light, and the regular lock sound like the heartbeat of an invisible monster. In 1995, 41 years after the wooden cabin swallowed a 9-year-old boy from the world, the Benjamin Carter file, thought to have drowned in the dust of generations of officers, unexpectedly came to light due to one small event no one expected would shake the entire case: a single hair. It lay in a yellowed paper evidence bag, pinned to the envelope's edge with Officer Henry Lewis's handwritten note, collected at Pine Hill Market, 1954, not valuable. At the time, the hair was considered meaningless because there was no blood, no clear root, no connection to other evidence, and no scientific method to analyze it. It was forgotten for 4 decades, lying silent like a mute witness to that 1954 afternoon that no one could name. But in 1995, Florida, like the rest of America, entered the era of modern DNA. Technology for analyzing trace evidence, unimaginable in the 1950s, could now extract a DNA profile from just a few cells on an old hair. When the Clearwater Police Department's old records room underwent a state-mandated review of all unsolved cases from 1950 to 1975, the Benjamin Carter file was pulled from the cabinet. A young officer named Daniel McKay, who had never heard of the disappearance, opened the evidence envelope and found the paper bag with the hair. He later recounted that what caught his attention wasn't the hair itself, but the note not valuable, which made him wonder why someone would determine evidence value by gut feeling alone. He asked a simple question, why not try? So the hair was resealed and sent to the Tallahassee Forensic Lab, which was using the latest 1995 DNA sequencing technology. The technicians received the sample cautiously. The hair was too old, the roots seemed detached, and long storage could have degraded or contaminated it. But new technology allowed amplification of just a few usable DNA segments, so they tried. It took nearly 2 weeks to prepare, process, separate the sample from the old paper, and remove natural oils. Under the microscope, that nearly anonymous light brown hair became clear. It was not a child's hair. The diameter, melanin level, surface texture, all matched an adult man's hair. The team performed multiple rounds of PCR to amplify the extracted DNA segments. The data was incomplete, but enough for a partial DNA profile, still strong enough to enter into Florida's newly digitized demographic and criminal database from the early 1990s. When the profile was entered, the technicians expected nothing. Many old samples were damaged or unmatched. But this time, after 36 hours, the system signaled a hit. A match appeared on the lab screen, a 67-year-old man living in Jacksonville, whose DNA was collected in a 1989 public disturbance case. The record was unrelated to violence, just a minor offense. The man's name was Thomas Rayner. The line, potential match, 87% confidence, prompted the technician to call McKay in Clearwater immediately. McKay, who had never handled a case this big, stood silent by the phone for a few seconds before noting the name, age, address, and basic background of Rayner. This was something the entire town of Clearwater couldn't have imagined for 4 decades. A hair once deemed worthless now became the first link between the afternoon Benjamin vanished and a real man in the world. But when McKay reviewed the 1954 file, he realized what tightened his heart. This hair was never recorded as found in any specific spot at Pine Hill Market. Just simply collected at scene. No location, no time, no note of who picked it up. And what made everything more confusing, the man Thomas Rayner, according to residency records, had lived in Jacksonville for many years, over 250 miles from Clearwater. Nothing in the 1954 file mentioned any stranger from Jacksonville. No witnesses reported seeing an out-of-towner. No truck with Duval County plates. Nothing matched, except one hair out of context, out of the era's investigative logic. But DNA doesn't lie. Biological profiles are the most objective data, and when the sample matched a specific individual in the same state, the Tallahassee lab confirmed it twice, 3 times before sending the official report. When the report reached Clearwater, McKay opened the envelope, reading each line with his heartbeat rising. Hair sample DNA matches. Subject Thomas Rayner, error probability, less than 1/10,000th, recommend further investigation. He set the report down, staring at the 1954 case file, the file once forgotten, misunderstood, labeled, no evidence of crime. All efforts over 40 years had been stuck because 1950s technology couldn't do what 1995 considered standard. And now, for the first time since Benjamin vanished, a clear lead appeared, not from statements, not from witnesses, not from major evidence, but from a single hair lying silent for 4.5 decades in a paper bag. For McKay, that moment was like opening a long locked door, gently, but enough for the dark room of the Carter case to glow dimly. And from that moment, Clearwater was no longer stuck in 1954. It stepped into 1995, the year DNA began speaking for the buried cries. After the DNA report from Tallahassee confirmed that the hair collected in 1954 matched a biological profile existing in the system, a man named Thomas Rayner in Jacksonville, Daniel McKay thought he had in his hands the lead that would blow the case wide open. But just 3 days later, everything suddenly veered in a direction so bizarre that it forced the entire Clearwater Police Department to pause and reconsider. The The man whose DNA matched did not exist as a real individual, or at least not in the way the Florida identification system understood it. The name Thomas Rayner was only attached to a DNA record taken during a public disturbance in 1989, but when McKay requested personal records, identification, residential address, social security card, or any civil data, all of it was blank. No birth certificate, no driver's license, no hospital records before 1988, no temporary residency registration. The 1989 file only contained a brief note: male, approximately 55 years old, homeless, no documents, self-identified as Thomas Rayner, but unverifiable, and even that name, Rayner, might not be real. This forced McKay to drive to Jacksonville to find out if the man in the record was still alive or had wandered elsewhere. When he arrived at the shelter where Rayner had been held in 1989, the manager said the man had left long ago. No one knew where, and only remembered that he didn't remember anything at all. Didn't remember his birthplace, didn't remember his real age, didn't remember family, didn't remember a single day from his past. He only knew his name was Thomas, and even that he sometimes forgot. McKay drove to Riverside Park, where homeless people often gathered, carrying the only photocopied photo from the 1989 file, a blurry, hastily taken image of a gaunt face, deep-set eyes, short ash-colored hair. He showed the photo to each person. And finally, a homeless woman pointed toward a large tree, where a man was sitting, knees drawn up under a thin blanket. She said, "That's him." But now he goes by a different name. The man sitting under that tree didn't look like someone who could be connected to a case spanning 40 years, tanned skin, gray hair, unkempt beard, worn-out clothes, eyes fixed on the ground, as if the outside world was too bright or too noisy to face. McKay approached, introduced himself, but the man didn't respond. He had to repeat it 3 times before the man looked up, his gaze drifting elsewhere as if McKay were a shadow. "Are you Thomas Rayner?" McKay asked. The man frowned very slightly, like a fleeting crack on a stone surface, then answered in a hoarse, almost whispered voice, "No, I think. My name is Daniel." "Daniel what?" McKay asked. The man blinked slowly, his eyes struggling to dig through an empty room in his memory. "Reeves. I think so." The answer was uncertain, incomplete, lacking confidence. McKay showed him the 1989 photo. The man looked at it without any sign of recognition, just quiet confusion. "That's not me," he said. "But they told me I was this person. I don't know." McKay recognized the expression well. It wasn't feigned, wasn't evasion, but a form of dissociative amnesia, common in people who had suffered severe, prolonged psychological trauma. When asked what his earliest memory was, Daniel Reeves only replied, "I remember waking up in Jacksonville, I remember days sleeping on benches, I remember hunger, but before that, nothing, no childhood, no parents' faces, no memory of any state he had lived in, no body language of someone lying, just emptiness, a deep kind of void, as if he had been uprooted from one life and replanted in another, without anyone noticing." McKay kept his distance, not wanting to pressure him, but he needed to verify the DNA. He explained simply, "We need to take a cell sample to confirm identity." Daniel didn't object. He held out his hand, trembling slightly from the cold weather or something deeper. When the technician took a cheek swab, Daniel sat still, eyes on the ground, as if the touch was reaching into a memory region he didn't dare enter. The sample was sent immediately to Tallahassee. McKay returned to Clearwater with an unnamed feeling, half hope, half unease. A homeless man with no past, no documents, no memories, yet his DNA matched a hair found at the 1954 crime scene. What did that mean? In the 3 days waiting for results, McKay read the entire old case file 3 more times, cross-checking overlooked information, inconsistent statements, undervalued evidence. All of it pointed to one thing: the shortcomings of the system back then, and now, the new system, with DNA, was pulling the case back into the light. When the DNA results from Tallahassee came back, McKay stood still for a long moment in front of the envelope. He opened it, read it, then read it again. Result: 99.4% match with the hair collected in 1954. The homeless man who called himself Daniel Reeves was the person whose DNA had appeared at Pine Hill Market on the day Benjamin disappeared. No doubt left, not a file mix-up, not a technical error, not coincidence. McKay leaned back in his chair, feeling the air in the records room freeze. If Rayner, or Reeves, had been present in the area where Benjamin disappeared, how was he involved in the case? And why had no one in Clearwater ever seen him at that time? Daniel Reeves, 67 years old, no documents, no past. Who was he? Where did he come from? Where had he been for 41 years? A person existing without history, without roots, without family. Yet his DNA tied to the biggest disappearance in the town's history. Those questions crashed down like waves, layer after layer, and McKay understood that what had just opened was not just a lead, it was the entrance to a labyrinth. And the figure standing at the center of that labyrinth, the man sitting under the tree in Jacksonville, the one who couldn't remember his own name, had now become the entirely new focus of this ancient investigation. A man with no past, but carrying within him the trace of the afternoon Benjamin Carter vanished. That man's name was Daniel Reeves, or at least, that was the only name he could remember. And from that moment, the biggest question was no longer, where did Benjamin go, but rather, who is Daniel Reeves really? After the DNA results confirmed that Daniel Reeves matched the hair collected in 1954, the investigation was no longer within the scope of a small seaside town police department. It immediately exceeded Clearwater's capabilities, and just 1 week later, the file was transferred to the FBI under federal standards for child disappearances involving historical elements and forensic technology. The agent assigned to take over was Special Agent Melissa Crane, an expert in reconstructing cold cases, who had previously worked on analyzing dozens of unsolved cases from the 1960s-80s. When she arrived in Clearwater, the first thing she did was not to meet Daniel Reeves or interview new witnesses, but to request that the entire 1954 file, all documents, evidence, reports, even scattered notes, be brought to a large room in the old police headquarters. The room was flooded with white light, and Crane stood in the middle of it like a surgeon preparing to reoperate on a body that had been stitched wrong from the start. She began by spreading out all the photos, witness statements, maps of the Pine Hill Market area, witness lists, and forgotten reports across bulletin boards covering 3 walls. Each piece of paper was numbered by her, marked with arrows, connected, color-coded by category, red for errors, blue for details needing verification, yellow for information that could be cross-checked with modern technology, black for parts erased by time. What astonished the Clearwater officers most was the way Crane read the 1954 file as if it had been written yesterday. She didn't treat it as an old case, but as a broken chain of data that could be reassembled if you knew how to find the connections. And when she finished her initial analysis, she looked at McKay, her voice sharp as a scalpel. There are at least 12 serious errors in the original investigation. She listed each error without avoiding or softening them. First error, failure to seal off Pine Hill Market on the first night, allowing all traces to be trampled. Second error, no photos of the scene, no diagram of the bicycle's position, the man in brown's position, or the shoe prints. Third error, failure to collect soil samples and shoe prints, losing the only evidence of an adult male's presence entirely. Fourth error, witness statements not recorded on tape or by stenographer, leading to memories shifting after a few days, with no original to compare. Fifth error, lack of cross-verification between witnesses, causing the timeline to become chaotic without control. Sixth error, assuming the child ran away too early, wasting the golden 48 hours interrogating parents instead of pursuing physical evidence. Seventh error, ignoring the cabin in Ocala Forest after a report of a child crying, the only lead pointing outside Clearwater. Eighth error, not checking regional hospitals and train stations in the initial days, standard procedure for child disappearances. Ninth error, not screening vehicles around Pine Hill Market beyond the green truck, which was mishandled. 10th error, not investigating the unnamed man standing under the banyan tree, the first witness to see him, but police noted it superficially. 11th error, not preserving long-shot evidence, including the hair, deemed worthless, yet later the key to breaking the case. 12th error, not creating a spatial movement map of suspicious activity. Modern methods show 1954 relied only on residents' memories without establishing fixed points. Crane stated each point with the calm precision of someone who had seen too many cases ruined by human mistakes. But when she mentioned the 6th error, interrogating the parents for 48 hours instead of protecting the scene, McKay noticed her voice drop. Not sympathy, but a very subtle, very deep anger. Anger on behalf of the child, abandoned by those who should have protected him. After listing the 12 errors, Crane began what only federal-level investigators could do, fully reconstructing the case using modern methods. She aligned the mismatched timelines, dissected each statement by reliability, remarked witness positions on real terrain maps, modeled the brown-coated man's movement based on Pauline's viewpoint, the green truck's direction from passers-by, possible locations of strange shoe prints from the first night. Then she requested reconstruction of 1954 Ocala Forest road maps to pinpoint the cabin Harold Keene had described, a lid ignored for 40 years. All those things in the hands of town police had been tangled papers piled meaninglessly. But in Crane's hands, they became an orderly network, a logical structure where finding the right node could pull the entire case forward. McKay stood silently watching her pin notes to the wall, recreating the timeline from 5:43 p.m. to 6:25 p.m., with every minute remarked. He suddenly understood why the FBI was given the case. They didn't see it as an event, but as an unfinished equation. When she laid out every detail again, Crane said a sentence McKay would never forget. The problem wasn't a lack of clues. The problem was that the clues were there, but seen through the wrong era's eyes. And from the moment Crane said that, the Benjamin Carter case was no longer yellowed pages, but a block of data being revived under the hands of an agent who understood that beneath every cold case lies a story that never truly went cold. After Special Agent Melissa Crane completed reconstructing the entire 1954 file and marked the Ocala Forest cabin as a node forgotten for 4 decades, her next step was something the Clearwater police had never been able to do, a forensic interview designed to activate dissociative memory, a modern technique for reaching frozen layers of memory in victims or witnesses who had experienced trauma. Daniel Reeves, the homeless man whose DNA matched the scene hair, was brought to a clean, quiet interview room with soft lighting, not the cold interrogation room he had encountered before. Melissa created a space similar to a therapy session, no metal table, no handcuffs, just 2 chairs placed far enough apart so Daniel wouldn't feel pressured. He sat down, hands clasped, eyes on the floor as if silence had weight. Melissa began not with direct questions, but with grounding techniques to help Daniel regain a sense of safety. She asked him to touch the chair fabric, feel his own breathing, close his eyes if he wanted. Daniel complied, his shoulders lowering bit by bit, like someone who had carried a burden too long. Then Melissa said softly, "Daniel, I don't want you to try to remember. I want you to let memory come on its own. Just describe sensations, sounds, smells, whatever appears first." Those words were like opening a tiny crack of light in his darkness. Daniel swallowed dryly, slowly opened his eyes, his gaze drifting into space, as if looking through the room. "There's a smell," he said quietly. Melissa didn't interrupt. She nodded slightly, signaling him to continue. Daniel blinked, then described in a flat voice, as if listening to echoes of distant memory. "Smell, damp wood, like old wood eaten by water, and gasoline. Not strong, but familiar." Melissa noted silently, damp wood, gasoline. This matched the decaying cabin deep in the forest, the exact area Harold Keene had mentioned in 1954. Daniel pinched the skin beside his eye lightly, as if trying to pull an image buried deep in consciousness. There's sound, insect sounds, not like in the city. Buzzing, long, like right next to the ear. He grimaced, the memory clearly unpleasant. At night, that sound didn't stop. It surrounded, like being trapped in bushes. Melissa shifted technique, asking, "You heard that sound where? In a room? Outside?" Daniel was silent for a long time, then answered, "In a room? No, not a room. It was small, dark, only a yellow light." McKay, watching through the observation glass, stood straighter when he heard yellow light. A cabin with a dim yellow bulb was an element from Benjamin's recounted memory that Melissa only had from old reports. Daniel rubbed his chest lightly over the sternum, as if steadying his breath. Floor, wooden floor. Every time, when that person came in, the wood creaked, slow, heavy. Melissa didn't ask who that person was, she let him lead. "Did you hear water?" Melissa asked, using reverse recall, prompting questions to bring memory through sensation rather than events. Daniel nodded faintly. "Yes, water sound, not the ocean. Not a river. It's slow, heavy, like water hitting tree roots, like swamp." A thick atmosphere enveloped the room. Melissa knew this was no longer scattered memory. It was taking shape. "Daniel," she said softly, "do you remember the door?" He nodded, and for the first time, his eyes didn't look down. They widened, staring into empty space, as if the image was appearing clearly. Door, wooden door, with scratches, long scratches, like someone once tried to pull or escape. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke. His index finger unconsciously traced an imaginary long line on the table. Melissa didn't touch him, but her voice softened, as if supporting the memory pouring out, "You're doing great, now, that man. What do you remember about him?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. A deep wrinkle creased his forehead. He closed his eyes, not to avoid the memory, but to hear it clearer. He, big, walked heavy, shoes with mud. Every step shook the floor. This was the detail Melissa had been waiting for, muddy shoes, heavy steps, matching the overlooked large shoe prints at Pine Hill Market. "Do you remember his face?" she asked, without pressure. Daniel opened his eyes. This time his gaze drifted, not focused, but floating. No, not clear. He touched a spot on his temple. But there was something on his face. "A mark." "Mark?" Melissa asked. "What kind of mark?" Daniel drew his finger from cheekbone down near the jaw in a diagonal line. "Scar, long, like, once cut." McKay in the observation room held his breath. An identifying facial feature, something the 1954 police never recorded, because no one asked witnesses clearly. Melissa knew dissociative memory couldn't fabricate such detail unless based on real experience. "Daniel," she said slowly, "did you hear a lock?" For the first time Daniel reacted strongly, his facial muscles tightened, hands gripped the chair arms. "Yes," his voice tore out. "Lock sound, metal, turning, click by click. Every time it sounded, it was." He stopped, breathing ragged. Melissa didn't push him to continue. She let silence stretch per technique, letting memory flow on its own. Daniel leaned forward, hands covering his face, his voice muffled between fingers. I had to be quiet, not move, not cry." That statement chilled the room by a degree. No explanation, no analysis, just feeling. Melissa waited until his breathing steadied, then asked, "Did you ever go outside the cabin?" Daniel opened his eyes, looking at her in confusion, as if trying to piece together the next fragments, but unable. "I don't know. I only remember the yellow light, the wooden door, the water sound, the scar," and he paused, forehead wrinkling, as if stabbed by an image directly into memory, and something slithering under the floor. "No, outside, near the cabin." "Alligator?" Melissa prompted gently. Daniel nodded sharply, as if finally naming the formless haunt. "Yes, alligator. Close. Very close." Melissa glanced at her notes. The cabin was near the wide eastern swamp in Ocala, where alligators were most abundant. For the first time, in 41 years, the cabin was no longer just a lone hunter's report, but a real focal point of the investigation, confirmed by the dissociative memory of the very man carrying the 1954 DNA. When the interview ended, Daniel sat still for a long while, seemingly exhausted after touching the memory he had forgotten, or been forced to forget, for nearly half a century. Melissa stood, quietly gathering her files, and in that moment, no one said it aloud, but everyone knew: the cabin. Where Benjamin had once been, where Daniel had been confined, where water sounds and lock clicks merged, had now become the center of the entire case. And Daniel's fragmented memories, for the first time, were no longer meaningless. They had opened the door that, 4 decades earlier, those responsible had overlooked. When the forensic interview concluded and the cabin in the Ocala forest became the center of the entire case, Melissa Crane realized that all of Daniel Reeves's vague memories, the sound of swamp water, the yellow light bulb, the scratched wooden door, the metallic lock clicking, the smell of rotting wood, could only lead to one horrifying yet inescapable conclusion: the only way out of the truth buried for 41 years. Daniel was not just a witness, he might actually be Benjamin Carter. But to put that in a federal report, to turn memory into legal evidence, Melissa needed something indisputable: medical, dental, and physical evidence, things that could not be distorted by time or dissociative memory. As soon as Daniel was taken to a medical support center to rest after the interview, Melissa called McKay into the old records room. She opened the lowest drawer, where the documents collected by Clearwater Police from the Carter family in 1954 were stored: elementary school report cards, a few handwritten samples from Benjamin, height-weight allergy records, and one critical file that no one had thought about for 4 decades, a preliminary dental record kept by the family dentist when Benjamin was 6.5 years old. In the 1950s, few families had complete dental records, but Mary, a careful mother, had kept a copy for her son and submitted it to the police as a last desperate measure. The file consisted of 3 pages, descriptions of baby and mixed teeth structure, 2 X-ray images of the front teeth and molars, and a marginal note: upper right incisor growing slightly inward, will need correction when older. That note seemed meaningless in 1954, but in 1995, it became a golden clue. Melissa held the file without speaking, only giving McKay a look. The look of someone who had just seen a door that could open. To verify, they took Daniel to the forensic dentistry lab in Gainesville, equipped for comparing dental morphology in unidentified remains or long-term missing persons cases. The forensic dentist, Dr. Howard Kirsch, performed the comparison without knowing anything about the case, a principle to avoid bias. He was given only 2 documents: the 1954 dental record of a boy and current dental images of a man approximately 67 years old. When Daniel opened his mouth for the X-rays, Melissa clearly saw his fragility for a moment. His hands clasped together, eyes looking down, as if the cabin memories were still hovering right behind him. But he cooperated. The X-rays were taken, developed, and placed next to the 1954 films under the bright light of the viewing box. Dr. Kirsch took less than 3 minutes to freeze, stare for a long time, then look up. Both have the upper right incisor deviated inward at the same angle. This is a very rare feature if it's random coincidence. He pulled his glasses down and examined closer. Lower left molar, curvature, occlusion, identical to the point I cannot call these 2 different individuals. Melissa felt a chill down her spine, not from fear, but because the truth was taking shape with no room left for doubt. But she still needed one more confirmation, something unchanged by time: bone scarring. In the 1954 file, Mary had reported that Benjamin had a bicycle accident at age 7, falling on gravel near the beach, tearing his left knee deeply enough to require 7 stitches. The injury left a long crescent-shaped scar, and the treating doctor noted, left patella shows minor trauma, will be visible on X-ray in adulthood. Melissa brought Daniel into the X-ray room and explained briefly, "We just need to check an old injury." Daniel showed no reaction. He was still in that half-awake, half-dreaming state, as if the cabin memories were pulling him into a dimly lit place. When the X-ray appeared on the screen, McKay and Melissa saw it before the doctor even spoke. On Daniel's left patella was exactly one old trauma mark. A faint streak curved in a crescent shape, matching the description in Benjamin's file. The doctor touched the film and said clearly, "This is an old injury from deep soft tissue tear and bone impact. This type of trauma cannot occur by coincidence." And it matches the 1954 description perfectly. Melissa did not blink for several seconds. She sensed McKay standing frozen like a statue, their breathing the only proof they were still alive in that historic moment. She requested the compilation of 3 layers of evidence, matching DNA, matching dental markers, matching bone scar. Those 3 placed side by side were no longer a hypothesis. They were a complete equation, an obvious truth, an irreversible conclusion. The FBI prepared the official confirmation report. The first line was in bold capitals: "Daniel Reeves is Benjamin Carter." The conclusion was signed by Dr. Kirsch, by the director of the Tallahassee Biometric DNA Lab, and by Special Agent Melissa Crane. And when the confirmation was stamped, no one spoke for several long seconds that felt like a lifetime, because the 41-year story, deadlocked and painful, had just changed its nature. The child missing since 1954 had not vanished. He had existed. He had lived. He was Daniel. In the white room of the forensic center, Melissa looked at Daniel, sitting on the plastic chair, back slightly hunched, hands resting on his thighs, and for the first time, she saw him no longer as a nameless homeless man. He had a name. He had a history. He had roots. He was Benjamin. And that truth, silent but blinding, placed the entire investigation into a completely new chapter. When the FBI confirmed that Daniel Reeves was indeed Benjamin Carter, the investigation immediately pivoted from identifying the victim to pursuing the identity of the person who had abducted, imprisoned, and made the boy disappear from the world for 41 years. The fragmented memories Benjamin recalled from the cabin, the metallic lock sound, the yellow bulb, swamp water noises, insects buzzing like they were right in his ear, the smell of damp wood and gasoline, heavy footsteps, mud-caked boots, and especially the long scar on the perpetrator's face, became the initial foundation for Special Agent Melissa Crane to build the offender's psychological profile according to FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit standards. She spread all the data gathered from the forensic interview across a whiteboard. The cabin deep in the eastern swamp area of Ocala, rarely visited. The perpetrator knowledgeable enough about the area to move undetected. The cabin had electricity, meaning he used a generator or ran temporary wiring. Food was brought in regularly. Drinking water supplied in metal containers. The cabin had no windows or they were sealed shut. The victim was kept alive for a long period, enough to warp the child's psyche, but not killed. And most importantly, the perpetrator was familiar with swamps, familiar enough not to fear alligators. Melissa began by dividing the data into 4 groups: environment, behavior, containment techniques, and logistics. The environment indicated the perpetrator was tied to the forest swampwood region, possibly born in Marion or Putnam County. Behavior showed he wanted absolute control, but did not want to kill, at least initially. Containment techniques proved he knew how to isolate the victim from outside sounds, prevent escape, yet maintain basic survival. Logistics showed he had means to transport a 9-year-old boy from Clearwater to the Ocala forest, nearly 120 miles, without detection. After categorizing, Melissa stood in front of the board, hands braced on the table edge, and told the team, "He's not a passerby. This wasn't an impulsive crime. This is someone who prepared, had a cabin, food supply, access routes. This is someone who belongs to the forest." From there, she began building the offender profile. The Gator Man, the temporary name the team gave based on the environment around the cabin. First characteristic, male gender. Most long-term control crimes against juveniles are committed by male offenders. And Benjamin described a deep voice, heavy breathing, large rough hands. Second, estimated age at the time of the crime, 35, 50 years. The physical build of the man with heavy steps, large boots, carrying metal objects, breathing that increased with exertion, indicated he was not too young. With 41 years past, if still alive, he would be 75, 90. Third, deep knowledge of swamps, slow-moving water, alligator sounds, meaning someone who grew up or lived many years in Ocala or nearby. A stranger could not build a cabin in alligator territory without fear or knowing how to avoid them. Fourth, experience with wood tools and gasoline, likely a carpenter, logger, construction worker, or manual laborer. The cabin showed makeshift repairs, but was solidly built by someone skilled. Fifth, long facial scar, a strong identifying feature. Most criminal or accident records from the 1930-1950 era noted prominent facial injuries. Sixth, likely prior violence. Long-term child abductors almost always have a history of violence, even if not formally convicted. Seventh, isolated lifestyle, almost completely detached from community. He kept the cabin secret, had no close associates, no neighbor interactions. Once these characteristics formed a framework, Melissa began cross-referencing with Florida data from the 1940s, 50s. She asked McKay to pull records from 3 agencies: Ocala Police, Putnam County Police, and the Marion County Sheriff's Office. Her screening criteria were clear: males born 1900, 1915, facial injury, history of minor crimes or disturbances, living in forested areas, or working in wood construction, and noted as living in isolation. The initial search yielded 57 names, but most were eliminated for not fitting the cabin environment description. Melissa narrowed further using the most critical criterion: proximity to alligator-heavy areas. The cabin had distinctive swamp water sounds, meaning the perpetrator was familiar with Lake Kearney, the Silver Glen Run, or deep juniper prairie. These areas were close, but outsiders could not penetrate without getting lost or endangered. Finally, the list was reduced to 5 suspects, all of whom had lived, worked, or secluded themselves in the Ocala area at the time of the crime. Suspect 1, Walter Griggs, 42 in 1954, logger, injured in chainsaw accident, leaving a long scar on left cheek. Arrested for bar fight in 1949. Lived alone on the edge of Ocala Forest. Suspect 2, Ernest Hale, 50 in 1954. Owner of a fishing shack, knew swamps well. Scar along right jaw from truck accident. Reported for strange behavior with children, but insufficient evidence to prosecute. Suspect 3, Morgan Till, 38 in 1954. Road construction worker. Scar from ear to chin after brawl. Disappeared from Ocala for several months in 1953, for unknown reasons. Suspect 4, Samuel Drayton, 46 in 1954. Itinerant hunter living in the forest. Multiple reports of occupying abandoned cabins. Long facial scar from animal claw. Suspect 5, Charles O'Reilly, 35 in 1954. Eccentric loner, seasonal worker. Hospital record of 1948 facial injury from workplace accident. All 5 men matched one or more key profile criteria: age, living environment, forest/swamp-related occupation, Ocala terrain knowledge, and especially the facial scar. Melissa marked each with separate symbols, connecting data points with red strings crisscrossing the board, like the skeleton of a giant creature that had slept for 4 decades. When she stepped back to view the entire structure, she whispered, low but clear enough for McKay to hear, "He's not invisible, he's just been shielded by time." From that moment, the team knew they were no longer chasing a shadow. They were hunting a real person, a man who once walked the damp, dark trails of the Ocala forest. While Melissa and McKay narrowed down and analyzed the remaining suspects, one name unexpectedly surfaced from the dusty Marion County files, a name that never appeared in any 1954 Clearwater list, simply because he lived so far on the fringes of society that no one thought he had information. Leonard Harlow, a reclusive alligator hunter who had lived hidden for over a decade in the Ocala forest. And as the scattered data about him was pieced together, The entire team felt a chill run down their spines, because Harlow did not just match the Gatorman profile, he matched it in a way that made the whole investigation team go cold. The file on Harlow was chaotic and fragmented, consisting only of a few torn sheriff reports from Marion County, spanning the 1940s, 70s, a black and white side profile photo taken in 1946, and a short 1953 report noting his arrest for violent behavior, but released because the victim refused to testify. In the photo, his face was rough with deep wrinkles, eyes sunken, and what made Melissa freeze was the long scar running from his left cheek, nearly to his chin. Exactly the shape Daniel had described when the cabin memories surfaced, a scar impossible to mistake. But the scar was not the only thing that made him stand out. The second line in his occupational record read, "Alligator Hunter." Operating along Juniper and Silver Glen swamps, Melissa immediately marked it in red, matches suspected cabin location. No one but an alligator hunter would dare live near those swamp areas. Dark water, tangled roots, surface covered in duckweed, and the deep rumbling of alligators at night, like a forest ritual. Everything Daniel described about slow-moving water, alligators passing close to the cabin, insects swarming, all matched the environment Harlow chose as his hideout. McKay flipped through the pages, stopping at a 1948 report. Leonard Harlow, 29, arrested after assaulting a bar employee. Victim described him as breathing heavily, dragging steps, hoarse voice, smelling of gasoline and wood. Gasoline smell, wood smell, the two odors that clung to the cabin in Benjamin's 40-year memories. In another separate document, the Marion County Sheriff noted that Harlow transported hunted alligators in an old truck. The kind that always reeked of gasoline. Was this the green truck two witnesses mentioned at Pine Hill Market in 1954? No one could be sure, but the coincidence made Melissa circle his name thicker. Continuing the review, they found local Ocala forest witnesses who described a reclusive man who rarely interacted, only appearing to trade animal skins or buy gasoline. People said he didn't like children, spoke incoherently, and lived in a self-built cabin whose location no one knew. Self-built cabin, location unknown. A man once argued after being accused of staring at a neighbor's child. A man suspected of odd behavior, but no one pressed charges because everyone feared him. In a 1952 report, a Salt Springs store clerk noted that a large man with a scarred face, whose steps made the wooden floor shake, bought large quantities of canned goods and rope. Rope used to secure the cabin door or drag game. Canned goods, long-lasting food, like what Benjamin remembered being placed under the floor. Melissa set the report down slowly, as if forcing her mind to process each layer calmly. Every characteristic in the offender profile, male, 35, 50, isolated, familiar with Ocala swamps, history of violence, facial scar, gasoline smell, wood knowledge, heavy steps, all converged on one single person, Leonard Harlow. But the most suspicious detail was the last in the file. He vanished in 1979. No change of address form, no hospital records, no missing person report, no relatives claiming death. He simply ceased to exist. One witness said his cabin was found abandoned, walls rotting, inside still holding unopened dry goods boxes, as if he left suddenly. A local comment that made Melissa note immediately. Harlow left in the night. No one knows where. Some say an alligator dragged him under. Some say he went deeper into the forest and never returned. But there was no evidence. No one really searched for him, and no one knew where his cabin was. But everyone knew it existed. Harlow was the shadow of Ocala, appearing and disappearing, minimal records, few traces, leaving only scattered pieces like a wild animal passing through then vanishing. Melissa felt this match was not mere investigative coincidence, it was something buried for 40 years now, rising from the swamp surface, revealing itself layer by layer at the exact pace of DNA and dissociative memory. Upon re-examining the 1954 files, Melissa discovered something that made McKay gasp. Clearwater had never contacted Marion County to inquire about any men living in the Ocala forest. If they had in 1954, Harlow's name might have surfaced immediately, but they didn't. And so he remained outside the investigation, continuing to exist in secrecy like an untracked predator. Melissa marked his name in red, not just circling, but drawing a second outline for emphasis: high priority. Potential offender, Gator Man. Then she cross-checked age. In 1954, Harlow was about 35, 38. Perfectly within the offender age range. Height, 6 feet 2. Matching the heavy steps Benjamin described. Occupation, alligator hunter. Explaining alligator sounds under the cabin, swamp smell, water noises, and absolute familiarity with Ocala. History, violent, fitting victim control behavior. Scar, exact match. Lifestyle, isolated, unsupervised, allowing long-term imprisonment. Disappearance timing, 1979, coinciding with cabin abandonment. Everything fit, as if the Gator Man profile had been written from Leonard Harlow's own life. When Melissa stepped back to view the analysis board with Harlow centered, she said slowly, each word deliberate, as if stamping it into the air. If there is one single person in all of Florida capable of abducting Benjamin, it's him. McKay did not object. No one on the team objected. Harlow was not just a suspect. He was the nightmare of the Ocala forest. A man mysterious enough to vanish, cruel enough to keep a child in a cabin, and knowledgeable enough about the swamps, never to be found. And now, after 40 years, that time-covered name had become the center of the entire investigation. Leonard Harlow, prime suspect in the 1954 abduction, the man every piece pointed to. The man the FBI now called by one name only, the Gator Man. When the name Leonard Harlow emerged as the central suspect, and every piece in the profiler matched to a degree that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, Special Agent Melissa Crane knew that the next step could not be delayed another hour. They had to locate his cabin, the place where Daniel Benjamin had been held captive in the hazy memory of a 9-year-old child, swallowed by 40 years. They named the operation Operation Cabin 31, based on the 31st coordinate on the Ocala terrain analysis map that Melissa and the GIS team had established. A map reconstructing the Ocala forest environment from 1950-1960 was built using old survey data, aerial photos, and accounts from early hunters in the area. Ocala Forest, spanning more than 300 square miles, dense like a labyrinth that guarded its own secrets through time. But Melissa knew the perpetrator could only have lived in an area that simultaneously featured three elements: alligator-infested swamps, ancient pine woods, marshy land firm enough to build a cabin. When the forensic and search unit entered Ocala at 5:20 a.m. that day, the fog was so thick that flashlight beams seemed to lose half their light. No one spoke. Everyone felt the weight of what awaited them after decades. After nearly 2 hours moving along narrow paths, barely wide enough for one person, guided by an elderly hunter who had met Harlow in his youth, the team stood before a patch darker than the rest of the forest, tree canopy closed so tightly that the sky was invisible. And there, behind vines twisted into strips like curtains of time, the cabin appeared. A block of old wood, partially sunk into the mud, roof tilted to one side, wooden door cracked vertically. The cabin was too small to be a long-term residence, too damp to be a temporary shelter, yet too sturdy to have been built by an amateur. The entire team stood silent for a few seconds. Melissa was the last to cross the threshold. She touched nothing, just took a slow, deep breath. The smell of damp wood. The smell of old gasoline. The smell of rusted metal. Exactly as Daniel had described. Flashlights swept across the rotting wooden floor, clearly revealing indentations, circular, even dense, like the heavy footsteps Benjamin had described in the cabin 40 years earlier. Beneath the thick dust, the floor still showed curves where the wood had been compressed by great weight. McKay turned to Melissa, his eyes saying it clearly, "This is the place." Forensic began setting up scene protection, marking areas with tape. In just minutes, the cabin transformed from an abandoned ghost into a body undergoing re-examination. A technician with blue light scanned the walls. Scratch marks appeared like invisible handwriting, running from near the doorknob down to the floor. Long, dented, uneven scratches, like the desperate pulls of a small child trying to open the door. Melissa froze when she saw them. No forensic expertise was needed to understand what that meant. The victim had tried to get out. Near the left corner of the cabin floor, a technician discovered metal slide marks, small but clear enough to trace the grooves. They probed with a stick. The echo sounded like chains. It didn't take long to find the key piece, a rusted chain segment about 30 centimeters long, partially buried under decayed leaves. Though time had worn it down, the naked eye could still see the bent links, as if they had once endured someone's yanking force. A section of wood at the base of the wall had a circular indentation, the chain's anchor point. When comparing the height of this dent with the chain's length, Forensic confirmed it perfectly matched the height of an 8-10-year-old child restrained while sitting. Benjamin had been right. He couldn't move more than a few steps inside the cabin. The cabin walls told their own story. Up close, countless small shallow knife marks embedded in the wood, mostly clustered on one side, sharp-edged shapes. Forensic determined these were not carving marks but acts of intimidation, like someone swinging a knife into the wall to assert power or subdue the victim. Melissa didn't need to imagine who held the knife, and who was the child cowering in the corner when those marks were made. A technician at the door called out, "Agent Crane, on this doorframe, there's something you'll want to see." Melissa approached, the rough wood, faded by years, but right beside the hinge, under low-angle light, clear scratches appeared in the same direction and position that Daniel had reenacted with his hands during the forensic interview. Long, diagonally slanted scratches, shallow depth, nearly identical to the victim's description. No longer distorted memory, no longer vague. This cabin was the place, but the strongest evidence lay on the dirt floor, just outside the cabin door. Beneath dried mud, Forensic uncovered a shallow footprint, blurred by time, but with measurable sole pattern and size. They measured quickly, and no one breathed for a few seconds when the numbers appeared. Size 12, 13, exactly matching the shoe prints that appeared at Pine Hill Market in 1954 and were overlooked by Clearwater police. Melissa knelt down, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. This was the link connecting the Clearwater scene to Ocala, a thread severed in 1954, now reconnected by modern DNA and forensics. When measuring depth and pressure distribution, Forensic confirmed it was the print of a man weighing 180, 200 pounds, matching the description of Harlow's heavy footsteps in the Marion County file. McKay stood frozen, speechless. Melissa turned back to the cabin, meeting each detail with her gaze. The dangling yellow bulb, rotted wiring, but still showing metal traces, floorboards dented where a child sat for long periods, moss-covered walls, still emitting an old oil smell. A corner with slide marks, as if someone had once slept or sat curled up for hours. The cabin was no longer an anonymous spot in the forest. It was a crime scene. It was evidence. It was the voice of 40 years of silence. Forensic collected wood samples around the scratches, chain samples, soil beneath the cabin, fabric fibers caught on the door hook, all sealed in modern evidence bags. No one argued. No one doubted that Cabin 31 was where Benjamin Carter had been held. As the team prepared to leave the area, a technician at the end of the line called out, "Agent Crane, you'll want to see this." They led her behind the cabin, where the ground was damper and tree roots protruded. Beneath thick leaves, a deep drag mark appeared, about 1.5 meters long, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground. Melissa stood for a long time, eyes fixed on the mark. No one dared guess what it was. No one spoke. Any explanation would come only from later forensic stages. But Cabin 31, the wooden house where time had once buried a child's cries, was no longer a mystery. it had emerged under harsh forensic light, with every chain link, every knife mark, every scratch, every echo of Benjamin's painful memories. Cabin 31 was where Benjamin was imprisoned. Cabin 31 was where the Gator Man once stood. Cabin 31 was where the truth had finally been revealed, after 41 years buried in Ocala's forest mud. After Cabin 31 was confirmed as Benjamin's place of captivity, and every trace in the rotting wooden house matched the victim's account. The investigation team knew the truth could not be closed without determining the fate of Leonard Harlow, the man every profiler piece pointed to as the only plausible perpetrator. Yet the biggest problem lay in time itself. The man had vanished from all civil records since 1979, and scattered rumors around Ocala about him being dragged off by an alligator, or going deep into the forest and never returning, only made Melissa feel like she was chasing a ghost. She needed something concrete, physical, tangible, and in Marion County, where time always hid the most important things beneath layers of damp mud, an unexpected clue surfaced when McKay reviewed unidentified body records in the old morgue, a nameless corpse found in 1979, in an area very close to the forest locals described as Harlow's old territory. The report stated the body was a male aged 60, 70, wearing old hunting clothes, long beard, prominent cheekbones, heavily decomposed due to the humid environment. No personal items, no papers, no identification. The report at the time concluded, natural death or forest accident, and the body was buried in the unmarked graves behind the Marion morgue, numbered #1979, 0142. Melissa stood before that old document for a long while, then said, "Exhume." The exhumation order was signed that same day, and nearly a week later, on a cold morning, the entire team was present at the small cemetery north of Ocala, where dozens of unmarked graves lay in rows like untold stories. Grave #1979, 0142 had only a small metal plate, no name, just a fading number under moss. When the earth was dug up and the rotted wooden coffin appeared, no one spoke, but the silence was heavier than any guess. The body had almost completely decomposed, leaving only bones, a few fabric scraps, and on the left cheekbone, a long bone cut matching the scar position noted in police records. Forensic collected femur bone samples, and 3 intact remaining teeth, sealed them, and sent them immediately to the Tallahassee lab. During the 3 weeks of waiting, no one on the team dared declare anything, even though all logic pointed to one conclusion. Melissa didn't sleep a full night during that time, not out of fear, but from the tension of standing at a historical crossroads. Either they found the perpetrator, or they lost the final chance to close a 41-year-old case. When the DNA results arrived, the meeting room fell silent, as if all sound had been drained. The report was only 2 pages, but the most important line was in the middle of the first. DNA from bone samples matches 99.7%, with Leonard Harlow's DNA in Marion County records. McKay exhaled, as if he hadn't breathed in years, while Melissa simply closed her eyes for a second, allowing herself to acknowledge that this long journey had finally reached an irreversible boundary. No doubt remained, the unidentified body from 1979 was Leonard Harlow. The perpetrator was dead. The Gator Man, the man who once imprisoned a child in a cabin with a dangling yellow bulb, whose heavy steps made the floorboard shake, who bore a long scar on his face, had been gone from this world 16 years before the case was reopened. But though his death prevented any legal punishment, it did not diminish the forensic value. Melissa submitted the report to the FBI, and the case was classified solved, offender deceased. No trial, no court appearance, but criminal responsibility could be concluded. They could tell the world that Benjamin Carter did not run away, was not abused by family, did not meet an accident. He was abducted by a reclusive man in Ocala Forest, a man the tools of 1954 were insufficient to detect. And now, after 41 years, the final circle closed. The perpetrator identified, the victim found, and the truth finally escaped the forest mud, crossing generations of mistakes to stand in modern forensic light. "Solved," Melissa said. Her voice neither loud nor proud, just the truth placed where it belonged. But beneath the word solved, she had to add a required legal note, but not closed legally. Because even though the perpetrator was dead, the case still had questions that could not be brought to criminal court, could not be fully completed procedurally, could not be erased from the system as a completely closed file. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that in the moldy wooden cabin in Ocala, time no longer held secrets. What mattered was that the scarred man was gone, and the truth had finally spoken after 4 decades buried. Most importantly, Benjamin Carter, the boy the world had forgotten, had been given back his true story, and the case once buried deepest in Florida had now entered a new chapter, the chapter of confirmation, of light, and of justice. Late, but no longer silent. After the DNA report confirmed Leonard Harlow as the perpetrator, and the case was classified solved, offender deceased, Melissa Crane knew it was time to inform Mary Carter, the mother who had lived 41 years in the shadow of one single question: where is my son? She was 74 years old, living in the house that still kept Benjamin's room exactly as it was on that final night in 1954. Visiting Clearwater Police every year to ask the question everyone had grown used to hearing. But no one dared answer. "Any news about my son?" That phone call, Melissa's voice gentle but precise. "Mrs. Carter, we've found Benjamin. He's alive." The other end of the line was silent for so long that Melissa thought Mary had dropped the phone. But then a trembling breath escaped. A breath so shaky, it seemed her entire body couldn't bear the shock of truth. "You said, alive?" Mary whispered. "Yes," Melissa replied. "And he's being cared for at Jacksonville Hospital." Mary didn't cry right away. People who have lived too long in pain don't cry when happiness arrives. They only tremble. She set the phone down, her aged hands gripping the table edge, as if time had just collapsed and suddenly rebuilt itself. More than an hour later, she was driven in a police car, accompanied by McKay, who said he wanted to personally take her to see her son on the 40-mile drive to Jacksonville. The sky gray and a light wind blowing, as if early Florida spring was holding its breath. Mary said not a word the entire journey. She only stared out the window, her aged eyes wide open, as if trying to stay awake before something her heart had waited half a lifetime for. At the hospital gate, McKay opened the door and offered his hand. "You can rest a moment," he said. But Mary answered softly, her voice almost dissolving into the air. "No, I've waited 41 years. I want to go straight in." Jacksonville Memorial Hospital was unusually quiet that evening. The white-lit hallway reflected Mary's slow footsteps, her hands trembling but resolute. Melissa was already waiting outside room 212, where Daniel Reeves, Benjamin, was being monitored after mild panic episodes. When Mary stopped at the door, Melissa looked at her a second longer than necessary, reminding herself that this moment belonged not to the investigation, not to the FBI, not to the law. This moment belonged only to a mother and the child she had lost. "Are you ready?" Melissa asked. Mary nodded, but her shoulders slumped slightly right after, as if her body couldn't bear the rising flood of emotion from her chest. The door opened slowly, almost deliberately, letting light from the room spill out little by little. Daniel sat on the bed, leaning against pillows, eyes gazing out the night window. His hair was gray, his face aged, but his eyes, those eyes were still the eyes of the boy Benjamin in the 1954 photo hanging in Mary's bedroom. When the door made a soft sound, Daniel turned his head. His gaze met Mary's for the first time in 41 years. She stood there, small in her old coat, eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, as if she was too afraid that blinking would make the scene vanish like a dream. Daniel looked at her for a long time. His eyes traced every wrinkle on Mary's face, the folds of time the boy he once was had never known. A flash of confusion passed through his eyes. Then, something shifted. A small, subtle movement, like a formless memory touching the surface of water. "Mom?" Daniel whispered, almost just a breath. Mary raised her hand to her mouth, her whole body folding under the weight of that word. No one in the room breathed. Melissa turned away. McKay clenched his fists. Mary took one step, then another, like someone walking on the thin edge between hope and shattering fear. When she reached the bed, Daniel was staring at her without blinking. Though 41 years had erased nearly all his childhood memories, one kind of memory never fades. The memory of the first person who held him when he fell, the first who called his name when he startled at night, the first person the child Benjamin had tried to run to that afternoon in 1954. He didn't remember everything, but he remembered enough to know that face, despite countless changed details, was still the face of the person he called Mom. Mary didn't hug him right away. She stood trembling before him, hand reaching out, but hesitating, as if afraid to hurt him, or afraid to touch what she had never dared hope for. Daniel looked at that hand for a second, then raised his own and placed it in hers. "I'm sorry," he said, not knowing why he said it, only knowing his heart was breaking at the same moment. Mary collapsed beside the bed and embraced him, as if letting go would allow time to steal him again. Daniel rested his head on her shoulder, and for the first time since being found, he cried, not the crying of an adult, but the broken, choking sobs of a child abandoned too long in the cabin's darkness. The minutes that followed were ones no one on the team dared interrupt. Melissa quietly closed the door, leaving them in that bright white room, an ordinary hospital room now holding something Florida had not witnessed in 41 years. A reunion no one thought would ever happen. Mary stroked his hair, her aged hand trembling. "My son, I'm here. I'm here." Daniel could only repeat 3 words. "I'm here." 2 people, one aged by waiting, one who lost a lifetime because his childhood was stolen, sat together like 2 pieces torn apart by time and crime, finally returning to their proper place. Outside the window, ambulance lights reflected on the white wall, like pulses of a heart being reconnected after 4 decades out of rhythm. In that room, there was no FBI, no forensics, no cold case files, only a mother who had found her son again, and a child whose life had turned into someone else, with a different name, finally finding the place he belonged. Mary squeezed his hand and whispered, her voice trembling like a thread. "Let's go home, Benjamin." Daniel didn't answer right away. He only looked up, gazing at the face of the person who had waited half a lifetime for him. Then he nodded gently. A nod of 41 years returning, a nod of a life finding itself in an aged mother's face. On that hospital bed in Jacksonville, Florida, seemed to hold its breath, and the reunion that had waited nearly half a century finally became reality. After the reunion in Jacksonville, when the tears on Mary's face had not yet dried, and Daniel, Benjamin, was still relearning the feeling of being called by his real name, the investigation team arranged for him a first conversation in a small, warm and quiet room, with no cameras, no harsh lights, just a wooden table and 2 glasses of water placed in the middle. Melissa sat across from him, but this time she was not acting as an agent. She sat like someone who wanted to hear the story of a life that had been broken. Daniel clasped his hands together, staring at the table for so long that it seemed he would say nothing. But then he took a deep breath, and the first telling by Benjamin Carter, the adult, began like an old door opening, with the dust of time rising in the pale golden light. He spoke in a low voice, as if afraid of the very sound of memory. "I remember the yellow light first. It hung overhead, swaying every time he opened the door. I don't remember his face. Just the shadow." He paused for a few seconds, his fingers trembling slightly. "I remember the sound of the lock. I remember the smell of wet wood, and the sound of water hitting something below the cabin. When I close my eyes, I can still hear it. It's like time dripping slowly." Melissa did not interrupt. Daniel continued, his sentences fragmented but heavy, like stones lifted from the bottom of a deep well. "I remember trying to push the door, trying to claw the wood, but the wood was thick. My hands hurt so much that my nails tore. I remember the chain. Short, not long enough to go more than halfway across the room. He bowed his head. I thought, if I could open the door, I would run home. I didn't know where home was, but I remembered someone was waiting for me. Then, like a taut string pulled hard, the next stream of memory burst out. One night, there was heavy rain. I heard alligators very close. The house shook from the wind. I don't know why, but the chain was loose at one point. I pulled, with my whole body, and it snapped. I fell into the door. The wood cracked. Daniel raised his hand to his temple, as if touching the memory with his sense of touch. I don't know how I opened the door, but I ran. My feet hurt. Something cut into them. I ran through the forest, slipped down into a hollow, cold water. I didn't know where I was. Melissa asked very softly, "Do you remember anyone chasing you?" Daniel shook his head. I only remember him calling, not clear words, just shouting. Then heavy footsteps in the mud. He looked down at his hands. I remember pain in my head. I must have hit a rock or tree root. After that, everything went black. He stopped telling. His breathing grew heavier, but different from when he remembered the cabin. This time it was not fear, but the effort to cling to a fragment of time his brain had not touched in 40 years. When I woke up, I was somewhere near Jacksonville. Empty. Didn't know my name. Didn't know how old I was. I didn't remember my family. Didn't remember home. Didn't remember anything. He clenched his hands. I didn't know who I had been, so I became someone else. A name a stranger gave me. Thomas. Then Daniel. But I didn't have memories for that name. Melissa asked, "How did you live all those years?" Daniel took a slow breath, but did not avoid the question, wandering. One place for a while, another place later. I slept under bridges, in parks, in shelters. Sometimes someone gave me food. Sometimes I collected plastic bottles for a few coins. I did odd jobs, carrying things, washing cars, anything. But every time someone asked where I was from, I didn't know. He swallowed dryly. Sometimes I dreamed of wood, of yellow light, of water. But I thought they were just nightmares. He smiled faintly, a bitter smile of someone who had lived his whole life in a fog, without knowing what it hid. I never thought they were real. Daniel clenched his hands, his voice dropping like a confession. I often walked along big roads. I often sat watching children, not in a bad way. I just remembered the feeling of once being like them, but not knowing who was waiting for me at home. I felt something missing, like someone had been left behind. He was silent for a few seconds, then added, "I used to feel like someone was looking for me, but I didn't know who." Melissa breathed slowly. "That was your mother." Daniel blinked, a mild reaction, but deep, like a breeze touching something sealed away. I guess I sensed it, didn't remember, but sensed it. Finally, as if the entire 41-year journey condensed into one sentence, Daniel said, "I think I died once in that cabin. And the rest of my life was just me trying to find my way back." He looked toward the door, his aged eyes no longer clouded. "Now I know I really came back." Melissa nodded gently, asking no more. This was not a legal statement. This was the story of a wandering life. A man robbed of his childhood, his identity, his own language. But who somehow survived long enough to say one thing that Mary had waited a lifetime to hear: "I'm still here." In that conversation, for the first time, Benjamin Carter, the adult bearing the name Daniel Reeves, told his story. Not complete, not coherent, but honest, painful, and enough to connect the two ends of a life torn apart 41 years earlier. And for Mary, that was enough. After the first conversation, where Benjamin, in the identity of Daniel Reeves, recounted the fragmented memories of the cabin, the escape, and the decades of wandering shrouded in the fog of amnesia, the team of psychologists at Jacksonville Hospital began a comprehensive assessment of his mental state. The conclusion came just 2 days later: severe PTSD combined with dissociative disorder, the result of childhood captivity and extreme isolation, followed by 40 years without identity, personal memories, or social anchors. In the first nights after the reunion, the night nurse noted that Benjamin often woke suddenly, eyes wide open but not recognizing the person facing him, as if the cabin memories flashed in the darkness. He breathed rapidly, clutched the blanket, fingers curling as if touching the cold wooden floor of old. Once, he sat bolt upright and whispered, "The door, is it locked?" That question, simple, brief, contained 40 years of nameless anxiety. Even though the hospital room was securely locked from the outside per regulations, Benjamin still had to check 3 times before falling back asleep, as if his body only understood safety when confirmed by his own hands. Loss of time perception was the greatest psychological wound. Benjamin could not distinguish morning, noon, evening, could not feel the passage of days and months. When the doctor asked what day he thought it was, he only looked out the window and said, "I don't know. I just remember the sound of water." In many moments, he still used vague words to describe memories: night, yellow light, wooden door, breathing sound, words imprisoned in his mind for 40 years, with no way to attach to specific times. Dissociative identity disorder showed most clearly when he looked in the mirror. In the first few days, Benjamin often stood in front of the mirror for minutes, raising his hand to his face, touching the wrinkles, then asking Mary, "Is this really me?" The last memory he had of his body was the image of a 9-year-old boy running through Pine Hill Market. Then the darkness of the cabin, nothing between those 2 points. The gap was so vast that the brain could not recognize its own adult body. When the therapists identified this, they began a long-term psychological treatment process, divided into 3 main axes: recovering fragmented memories, stabilizing personal identity, and helping him integrate into society in the role of the once missing person, a role he had never imagined. The initial therapy sessions focused on recreating a sense of safety. The doctor asked Benjamin to describe the sounds in the room to distinguish past from present: the soft hum of the air conditioner, the sound of hospital vehicles in the yard, the footsteps of nurses, all used to frame him in reality. Gradually, Benjamin startled less when hearing a door open, less recoiled when someone's shadow passed by, less asked if the light would suddenly go out. But PTSD never disappears completely. It only lies dormant when properly supported. There were days when Benjamin remembered the cabin more than reality. He sat by the window, looking out at the hospital garden and telling Mary that the green of the trees made him unsure where he was. In one therapy session, the doctor gave him a 1954 Florida map and a modern map, asking him to try finding Clearwater. He looked at the maps for a long time, eyes drifting, then placed his finger on the edge of the paper and said, "I don't know the shape of that place." But Mary did not give up. She sat beside him every day, recounting every small detail of his childhood: the red bicycle, the mornings mother and son walked to the beach, the apple pie that Benjamin liked but always ate half and left the rest. At first, Benjamin did not respond, but after a few days he began asking very small questions. Was the beach very close to our house, or did I ever sleep in a room by the window? Each question was like a needle stitching together a torn piece of memory. Integrating into the new life, a life with his real name, real age, real family, was a challenge that no one in the hospital underestimated. Benjamin had lived 4 decades as a homeless person, without stable habits, without a daily schedule, without trust in society. Now, he had to learn to do things that ordinary people take for granted: respond when someone called his name, arrange clothes in the closet, eat 3 meals on time, stand in front of a door without fearing the lock closing. Melissa told Mary that this process could take many years. Benjamin's mind was like an old room, walls cracked, windows sealed for 40 years. To light it up again required step by step, gradually, without rushing. Even sleeping in the hospital room took time. The first night Benjamin only slept 2 hours. The third night, 3 hours. By the next week he could sleep 5 hours straight without waking in the middle of the night, thinking he heard a key turning. Yet, in each slow rhythm of recovery, there was one thing that kept Benjamin from collapsing: Mary. She held his hand in every therapy session, always there when cabin memories pulled him back into darkness, silent when he needed silence, and calling his name whenever he drifted into the void between two lives. A mother who waited 40 years for her child can rebuild an entire world just by her presence. Gradually, Benjamin began remembering things unrelated to the cabin. New memory fragments forming: the soft footsteps of Mary in the hospital corridor, the smell of tea she brought, the warm light on the wooden table, and the first time he slept without hearing water hitting tree roots. Benjamin's road back to life was long and bumpy. But for the first time since 1954, it was a real road, no longer blocked by the darkness of the cabin. In that small hospital room, amid the soft light and the Jacksonville wind blowing through the glass, Benjamin began relearning something stolen from him at age 9, how to live as a person with a present and a future. Benjamin Carter's return did not just shake one family's life, it made the entire state of Florida look at itself again, at the mistakes of 1954. At the legal gaps that once allowed a child to disappear from the map without detection, at the way police back then handled the scene with the bias of an era that did not understand every small trace could save a life. Immediately after the case was declared solved, Florida media unanimously asked if there had been a proper missing child reporting procedure, would Benjamin have been found sooner? That was no longer a blaming question, but became the driving force for a series of reforms, starting with emergency meetings between the FBI, Florida State Police, and county sheriffs. In those meetings, Melissa Crane, though federal, was invited to present in detail the 12 investigative errors of Clearwater in 1954. Her report, with images of Cabin 31, the uncollected shoe print, and the victim's account, became the standard document for the new reform program. Florida Missing Child Protocol Reform 1996. One of the biggest improvements was the complete rewriting of the missing child reporting procedure. Whereas in 1954, Clearwater Police took nearly 2 hours to accept the report and then devoted most effort to interrogating the parents, the new procedure required: any report of a missing child under 12 must be elevated to immediate alert level, regardless of family history or possibility of running away. Instead of waiting 24 hours or assuming the child would return when hungry, as the outdated view of the 1950s, police were required to verify the scene within the first 30 minutes. Another key point was the mandatory rule: all missing child scenes must be sealed immediately, whether a small market or a grassy area, to ensure no one outside investigators entered during the golden hour. Looking back at Pine Hill Market in 1954, where the only shoe print was trampled because police failed to seal it in time, people understood why Florida decided to change radically. Florida also established for the first time the Child Evidence Preservation Unit, a specialized unit handling evidence related to missing children, with staff specially trained in child psychology, interviewing young witnesses, and rules for preserving every small item like fabric scraps, hair, soil, or skid marks. All the details once overlooked in Benjamin's case now became mandatory to collect. But the biggest reform, symbolic and influential across the entire United States, was the birth of Florida's modern missing child alert system, seen as the initial version of Amber Alert. Although Amber Alert was officially adopted federally after 1996, Florida took the lead. The alert system via radio, local television, highway electronic signs, and even gas stations was built based on the tragedy of Benjamin Carter. Media agencies were required to respond within 10 minutes of police notification, completely breaking the slow model of the old decade, where media only appeared after days and often reported based on speculation. Another critical point in the reform was police training in handling child evidence, which barely existed in 1954. Now every officer was taught how to build timelines from young children's statements, understand fragmented memories, analyze offender behavior based on environment, and especially, never ignore small reports like a child crying in the woods, clues ignored for 4 decades in Benjamin's case. And Cabin 31, the place bearing the marks of time and crime, was used as a teaching model in many investigation classes, becoming a living lesson that no scene is ever too far to ignore. The reforms spread to forensics. Florida invested heavily in DNA technology, built a new testing lab in Tallahassee, and established a statewide DNA database to avoid cases like the unidentified homeless man, Daniel, who might otherwise have gone decades more without anyone knowing he was once a kidnapping victim. When the media wrote about Benjamin Carter, they did not just write about the child returning after 41 years, they wrote about a state learning from mistakes, turning loss into reform, turning the dark cabin in Ocala Forest into the motivation for Florida to become safer for other children. And for Mary, each change was like another light lit on the road where her son had once been left in darkness. Though the past could not be changed, Florida, thanks to Benjamin, had changed forever. The official FBI report, completed in December 1995, is regarded as the most comprehensive solved case document in the history of modern cold cases in Florida. A report over 200 pages thick, gathering 41 years of errors, silence, mistakes, and scattered memories, then reconstructing them into a unified portrait of the truth. It began with a cold but piercing opening sentence: the disappearance of Benjamin Carter, age 9, in 1954, was not an accident, not a runaway, but a deliberate crime. From there, the report delved into every forensic layer, timeline, and DNA data, like a film running backward in time to force the past to reveal what it had hidden. The first chapter analyzed the 1954 investigation process, detailing the errors that Special Agent Melissa Crane had systematized: the Pine Hill market scene not sealed, the large shoe print ignored, young witness statements not recorded, reports of a child crying in Ocala Forest not verified. Investigation focus wrongly shifted to the victim's family during the 48 golden hours. The report concluded that if just one of these errors had been handled properly, the likelihood of finding Benjamin within 72 hours would have been very high. The next section described retrieving all remaining evidence, including the hair strand deemed valueless in 1954. The report detailed the 1995 PCR DNA analysis process on the hair, describing sample degradation, gene region amplification, and finally the groundbreaking conclusion: the hair belonged to the man later known as Daniel Reeves. In fact, the adult Benjamin Carter. Forensic analysis continued with reconstructing the timeline of June 14, 1954, using both old statements and modern simulation. The timeline was rearranged in minute-second format, recreating the period from 5:43 p.m. when Benjamin left home to 6:08 p.m. when the last witness saw him near Pine Hill Market, the 25 toxic minutes in which the perpetrator acted. The report stated the 12-15-minute gap between 5:50 p.m. and 6:05 p.m. was when Benjamin was approached and taken. Based on witness sightings of the man in brown and the green truck, the FBI simulated the perpetrator's route, showing he likely parked behind the market, dragged Benjamin eastward, then left Clearwater via a low-traffic road. A three-dimensional diagram in the report showed Cabin 31 lying exactly within the perpetrator's realistic travel radius if he left Clearwater late afternoon. Every movement in the simulation was marked with supporting forensic data: soil on shoes, wind direction, sunset time, and distance to deep Ocala Forest. The third chapter of the report, the most quoted by media, presented the perpetrator's psychological profile. Based on behavior, captivity technique, and environment, the FBI built the profile: Gatorman, male 35-50, living in isolation, knowledgeable about swamps, facial scar, history of violence. The conclusion clearly stated, the only perpetrator matching all data is Leonard Harlow. The report then moved to examining Cabin 31. Forensic images taken under blue light showed claw marks on the door, knife marks on the wall, wood dents from the chain, and large shoe prints, all presented with scientific analysis. Notably, the report devoted a long section to matching the cabin shoe prints with the overlooked prints in Clearwater, 1954. Size, heel angle, weight distribution, and print depth all matched at a high statistical level. Next, the report delved into DNA, the linchpin of the entire case. It presented comparing the hair DNA sample with the sample from Daniel Reeves, then cross-referencing both with bone samples from the unidentified body buried in 1979. The DNA conclusion confirmed the body was Leonard Harlow, with DNA completely different from the victim, ruling out confusion. This section of the report was described as the moment that locked the entire case structure because it placed perpetrator, victim, and scene in a complete forensic triangle. At the end of the report, the FBI wrote a short but sharp paragraph. There is no reasonable doubt about the sequence of events. Benjamin Carter was kidnapped near Pine Hill Market by Leonard Harlow, taken to Cabin 31 in Ocala Forest, and held for an undetermined period before escaping in a severely injured state, leading to amnesia. The perpetrator abandoned the cabin and died shortly thereafter. The concluding section of the report was perhaps the part that moved Florida the most. The disappearance of Benjamin Carter was solved through the combination of modern forensics, advanced DNA technology, behavioral reconstruction, and scientific timeline reordering. This is one of the oldest cold cases in Florida history to be successfully resolved. And although the case was filed as solved but not legally closed, the report marked the end of a dark chapter that had lasted too long. It became evidence that no secret is more enduring than scientific progress, and no yellow light in a cabin deep in Ocala Forest can hide the truth forever. Even though the 1995 FBI report had pieced together nearly the entire picture of the Benjamin Carter case, in the conference room where the agents and investigators gathered after the public announcement, the atmosphere was not one of absolute triumph. Instead, it was a thick silence filled with questions that would likely never be answered. Melissa Crane stood in front of the whiteboard, staring at the diagram of Cabin 31, the photo of Leonard Harlow, the forensic timeline, and Benjamin's account, all of which matched with terrifying precision, but the unknown section at the bottom of the board still had 4 blank lines, each representing a shadow in the larger story. The first question that everyone thought of, and the one no one dared voice aloud throughout the investigation, was, were there other victims besides Benjamin? Cabin 31, with its knife-scarred wooden walls, claw marks on the door, and rusted chain marks, did not bear the traces of just one child. Some of the claw marks were higher than a 7-year-old Benjamin could have reached in 1954. There was a charred patch of wood that forensics could not date. An area of the floor warped in a way that did not match the pressure pattern of a small child's weight. Melissa knew the cabin had stood there for years before Benjamin was brought there and for years after he escaped. There were no records, no witnesses, no missing persons reports tied to Harlow, but the silence of the Ocala Forest did not allow them to rule out the possibility that he had abducted or held other children, or even adults. The FBI noted in the report insufficient data to confirm or refute the existence of a second victim, a statement far too clean for the chill the cabin evoked. The second question, was Cabin 31 the only location? Older hunters recalled that Harlow had moved around, setting up temporary cabins during alligator hunting seasons. The Ocala Forest was so vast that the forensic team took 4 days just to sweep the area around Cabin 31, and they had only touched the edge of the forest. If Cabin 31 was the last or longest place Harlow kept a victim, there must have been somewhere he prepared beforehand. A private dump site? A storage pit? Another older cabin? No one knew, and the Ocala Forest, with its tangle of roots and trackless swamps, offered no promise of answers. Melissa had once gently asked Benjamin whether he remembered being anywhere else before Cabin 31. Benjamin only shook his head, eyes wide with confusion. I only remember the yellow light. The third question divided the agents into 2 camps. Did Harlow have an accomplice? Forensic evidence showed the cabin was solidly built, with even, square joints that were hard to believe one man could achieve quickly in swampy ground. The cabin had electricity, even if only a temporary line from a generator that suggested someone helped, or at least someone knew what he was doing. But the surviving records painted Harlow as extremely isolated, rarely interacting, with no close friends. Hunters had seen him alone, the grocery clerk said he never spoke, and bar records described him as aggressive and unapproachable. A man like that was unlikely to have a traditional accomplice, but an accomplice did not necessarily mean someone who helped kidnap. It could have been someone who sold materials, ran the electrical line, or helped repair the roof without knowing the true purpose. And Florida in 1954 was full of people carrying their own secrets. There was no evidence pointing to an accomplice, but none ruling one out either. The final question, the heaviest one, was how long was Benjamin held before he escaped? There was no specific timeline. Daniel adult Benjamin could not remember days, seasons, or how long he had been there before the rainy night that allowed him to break the chain. The cabin had no calendar, no time-marking objects, no one coming or going except Harlow. Some signs suggested he had been there quite a while, worn spots on the floor where he sat regularly, warped wood where his back leaned against the wall, the fact that he remembered nothing of the outside world except the word mom. But forensics, with no old bones or time-stamped items, could not provide a number. 1 month, 3 months, half a year, or longer, no one knew. Melissa had once stood inside the cabin, closed her eyes, and tried to feel it. The compressed sounds of the forest, water slapping against roots, darkness thickening, and she understood that even a few weeks in that place could tangle time into something indistinguishable. And if Benjamin, the 7-year-old boy at the time, escaped on a rainy night, why didn't Harlow search for him or bring him back? That question led to a speculation the FBI only lightly noted. Perhaps Harlow was injured that night and lost mobility, or he lost the boy's trail in the dark forest, or he simply believed the child would die from snakes, water, or alligators. But all of it was speculation. And the truth, like the cabin's darkness, did not answer. When the report concluded, the UN Resolved Questions section had only 3 lines. Possible additional victims, unknown number of related cabins, actual duration of captivity unknown. Florida finally knew who took Benjamin, but it would never know everything that happened in the darkness of the Ocala forest. As the investigators closed the report and left the conference room, the unanswered questions hung in the air like the remaining shadows of the Ocala forest. But the core of the story, the part that Florida, the FBI, and the entire country would remember, was not in the mysteries, but in the meanings that had become clear after 41 years of a buried case. The Benjamin Carter case was not just a journey to find the perpetrator or return a man to his true name. It became a symbol of 3 things: the golden hour of investigation, the power of DNA technology, and the unquenchable faith of a mother. In every forensic conference after the case, the Benjamin Carter lesson always began with the first lesson: no minute is meaningless in the golden hour of a missing child search. The 1954 analysis showed that Pine Hill Market was not secured immediately. Footprints were trampled, witness statements were collected haphazardly, and a signal from the Ocala forest was ignored simply because police assumed children often wander off and return. For 3 decades, the nation used this example as proof. One wrong decision in the first 10 minutes can create 40 years of silence afterward. Changes in missing child protocols, securing the scene within 30 minutes, prioritizing abduction investigations over runaway assumptions, creating dedicated child forensic teams, all stemmed from the hard-learned lesson of the Benjamin case. And that was the first meaning. The golden hour is not a theoretical concept. It is the boundary between survival and lifelong disappearance. The second meaning, the power of DNA technology, was something no one in 1954 could have imagined. A single hair once deemed valueless, stuffed into a paper envelope and left in storage for 4 decades, ultimately became the key that pulled Benjamin out of the darkness. PCR technology, DNA database matching, bone analysis, all advances that did not exist when Benjamin was taken, yet they shattered the silence that had stretched like the shadow of Cabin 31 over his life. The FBI report used this very line: "No detail is too small when science is strong enough to hear it." One hair linked Daniel Reeves to Benjamin Carter. One footprint linked Cabin 31 to Pine Hill Market. One bone sample linked an unidentified grave to the perpetrator. DNA technology did not just solve the case, it gave voice to evidence once forgotten. And in this instance, it returned a life to a man who had lost his name, his memories, his entire past. The third meaning, and perhaps the most human one, was the unwavering faith of Mary Carter. The mother, who stood outside the Clearwater Police Department for years, who kept her son's room exactly as it was like a silent vow, who refused to accept that probably ran away. Conclusion: society pushed on her family. The story is not always a triumph of science. Sometimes it is simply the persistence of a heart that will not let go. Mary had no evidence, no leads, no support from the system of her time. She only had a mother's instinct that her child was still out there somewhere. When she held Benjamin's hand, the 50-year-old man, who was still her little boy, in the Jacksonville hospital, every reform, every forensic advance, every DNA breakthrough was placed in its proper context. All those advancements ultimately led to one thing: to allow a mother to hold her child again. The Benjamin Carter case reminds the world that every cold case, no matter how old and forgotten, is still a story of flesh and blood people, a child who vanished, a family torn apart, a community at a loss, and a system that made mistakes but learned to correct them. And when science advances enough to revisit the past, those mistakes can be fixed, not to erase the crime, but to restore the truth. In the end, the case left a simple yet far-reaching message: time may cover tracks, but it cannot erase the truth when people are determined to find it. That is why, after 41 years, the child from Clearwater was found. That is why the dark cabin in the Ocala forest finally had to open its door. That is why the man with no memories was given back the name Benjamin Carter. In the darkness Harlow created, Mary had lit a small lamp, a lamp that never went out. And when science grew strong enough to catch up to that light, the case was no longer a mystery. It became a lesson, a symbol, and an affirmation that no child deserves to be forgotten in the darkness of time. In 1996, when Florida had changed, when Cabin 31 was regarded as a historical relic of a once-forgotten case, when the FBI report had been archived in the national records, Benjamin Carter's life began again. Not from zero, but from the very 41-year void he had to learn to fill little by little. After months of psychological therapy, physical recovery, and reconnecting with the world beyond the Jacksonville hospital, Benjamin moved to Gainesville on the advice of experts and with Mary's agreement. Gainesville, a mid-sized college town more than 70 miles from Ocala, had a pace slow enough not to overwhelm him, yet lively enough for him to feel the pulse of ordinary life again. He rented a small second-floor apartment in an old red brick building, where large oak trees nearly covered the balcony, and the steady sound of students passing below created a comforting rhythm. On his first day moving in, Benjamin stood for a long time on the threshold, feeling as though he were standing before a door far larger than the cabin, larger even than the time stolen from him. A door opening for a man learning how to live as someone with a future. Mary stayed with him at first, but only to accompany him, not to smother. She understood that for him to stand firmly, Benjamin had to walk on his own legs, not those of the child imprisoned in the Ocala forest. She hung the only remaining family photo on the living room wall. A younger Mary, Edward beside her, and 9-year-old Benjamin in front, wide smile, bright eyes. Benjamin stared at the photo for a long time, not trying to remember, but quietly observing as if meeting an earlier version of himself for the first time. "You'll never be that boy again," Mary said softly, her hand on his shoulder, "but you're still you, and you have a whole life ahead to live the rest of it." Those words seemed to create a safe space, allowing Benjamin not to strain to become the child in the photo, but to be permitted to be the man who had survived everything. In the months that followed, Benjamin joined a Gainesville program designed to help formerly homeless people transition to stable lives. When the program staff heard his story, not the media version, but the one he told himself, they suggested he join a sharing group for people who had experienced major loss or identity crises. He hesitated at first, but then realized there were others, even if their stories were different, who understood the feeling of being cut off from an old life and having to rebuild from scratch. From there, he gradually settled into a rhythm he never knew he could adapt to: morning coffee at the cafe nearby, walks in Depot Park, attending public library book readings. Everything moved slowly, but for him, slow was no longer unsteady, slow was breathable. Then something else came to Benjamin, something no one suggested, but that he chose himself. He began volunteering with a Gainesville nonprofit dedicated to helping missing children and their families, where every file represented the waiting, fear, and hope he understood better than anyone. At first, he only organized paperwork and answered the 24/7 support hotline, but one day, when a mother called, voice trembling, breaking, asking whether her missing 12-year-old had any chance after 2 days, Benjamin heard Mary from 1954 in her voice. Without thinking, he said, "Don't give up. Please, never give up." After the call ended, the supervisor looked at him for a long moment and asked, "Would you like to talk to other families? Not counseling, just being there." And Benjamin nodded. He did not talk much about his own story. He used it only to listen. Sometimes he simply showed up in the room so parents of missing children could see him and know that sometimes time is not the end. He became a quiet symbol of hope. Not the kind the media celebrated, but the kind a survivor can pass to others, enough warmth so they would not let go. By the fall of 1996, Benjamin decided to do something Mary never asked for, but knew he needed: return to Clearwater, where it all began. The two of them went together. No police escort, no cameras, no reporters. Just mother and son in an old silver car, driving down Highway 301, passing flat fields and misty tree lines. When they entered Clearwater, the sun was low, golden orange light covering the rooftops like an echo of the cabin's lamp color, but this time, it was not darkness, it was warm light. Pine Hill Market was no longer the same. The old store had been demolished for a new convenience shop, but Benjamin still recognized the spot, not by its appearance, but by the feeling. He stood in the parking lot, looking at the place where his mother had once sent him to buy sugar and eggs, where he stepped out the door and vanished from the world. Benjamin said nothing. Mary said nothing. They just stood there, two people from two different eras, sharing the same patch of ground grown cold. Then they walked to the old Carter family home, now owned by someone else. Mary did not go in. She only stood on the sidewalk, her hand lightly touching the gate, as if reaching back to the past she had walked through alone for so many years. Benjamin looked at the house, feeling as though he were standing before a door the 1954 boy never got to reopen, while the 1996 man now had the right to stand before it without fear. They ended the trip at Clearwater Beach, where Mary used to take Benjamin every Sunday morning. The waves still broke white. The wind still carried the smell of salt. This time, when Benjamin stepped onto the sand, he did not tremble. He closed his eyes, listened to the waves, and for the first time, felt he was no longer being pulled back to the Ocala forest. "I don't remember the old days," Benjamin said quietly, eyes still closed, "but I remember this feeling, the feeling of peace." Mary squeezed his hand. "That's enough." When they left Clearwater, the sun had disappeared below the horizon. On the drive back to Gainesville, neither spoke. But that silence was not like the silence of the cabin, not like the silence of the 41 years torn from his life. This was the silence of a circle closing, of a journey to reclaim himself, reaching its end, of a man finally stepping out of the darkness. In 1996, in his small Gainesville apartment, Benjamin hung a map of Florida on the wall and marked 3 points with red pins. Clearwater, where he was taken; Ocala, where his world was locked away; Gainesville, where his life began again. When Mary asked why those 3 points, Benjamin replied, "Because I want to remember how far I've come." And so 41 years after the day he disappeared, his life, torn apart, broken, then mended, could finally be called by its proper name, a different life. The story of Benjamin Carter, the child abducted in 1954, missing for 41 years, then returned, reflects an important lesson for American society today. Every minute of delay, every mistake, every ignored belief can determine an entire lifetime. The Pine Hill Market case that year had no scene lockdown, the size 12 footprints were overlooked, and the Clearwater police at the time focused too much on suspecting the family, letting the crucial 48-hour golden window pass uselessly. Today, as America still faces thousands of missing child cases each year, the mistakes of 1954 remind us that no signal can be taken lightly. A child's cry in Ocala was once dismissed as rumor, but it was the real clue. In modern life, we too easily dismiss small signals: a child acting fearful, a neighbor behaving oddly, a car parked in the wrong place. But Benjamin's story reminds us that small does not mean meaningless. The second lesson comes from the forgotten hair in the paper envelope, the thing that ultimately cracked the case in 1995. In the age of DNA technology and digital data, the story reminds us to respect truth, respect science, and preserve information more carefully than ever. One small detail today can save someone tomorrow. And the most important lesson comes from Mary Carter, the mother who kept her son's room unchanged for 41 years and never believed the claim that the boy just ran away. Her belief was not blind. It was the strength to overcome the inadequate system of her era. In today's America, amid a busy and sometimes skeptical society, the story reminds us: speak up, persist, and trust your instincts when protecting those you love. Because sometimes, that very persistence is what brings someone back into the light. Thank you for following the entire 41-year journey to uncover the truth in the Benjamin Carter case. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next Cold Case Files. See you in the next video, where we will continue opening the doors of time and bringing light to stories once forgotten.